Warning, this podcast contains scenes of explicit nonsense and lore.
Previously on the Resident Evil podcast.
Then it feels vast and it encourages exploration a lot more. Certainly wouldn't put it in the same action bracket as Resident Evil 5 or 6.
I think I've had more jump scares in this game than I've ever had in any Resident Evil, and that's not to its detriment, because people will be like, oh, jump scares. But well-crafted, well-set-up ones, I was quite impressed.
Lady Dimitrescu feels just like a meme rather than a nemesis for me, I'm afraid. I wasn't scared by her.
Given Mercenaries a sort of extended play the other day, that it felt more like akin to playing the more recent Doom games than a Resident Evil game, and I say that as a full compliment.
People will come away from this game with a smile on their face. They would have enjoyed it. Best storyline in a game since Resident Evil 5.
Resident Evil Podcast.
Hello and welcome to episode 69 of the Resident Evil Podcast, experiencing RE Village the only way we know how, by moving to an actual village with the werewolves. I'm Nick, better known as Neptune, recording 47 meters down. Let's see who's joining us today. He's the Joker of our pack, it's the Batman.
Hello there.
Ultimate life form, or room for improvement? You decide. It's Stars Tyrant.
Hello.
25 years of Resident Evil, 25 years of him. In the community, it's Rombie.
Hello.
And finally, he's split from the Trevor and Chamberlain Construction Company. It's the biggest divorce since Kanye and Kim. It's George Trevor.
Howdy.
Coming up on today's podcast, we'll be having that deep dive into Resident Evil Village, now that the dust has settled and spoilers are on board and well allowed. Review was done last time. We hope you all enjoyed it. That was our non-spoiler review. So today we're going to be focused on the lore implications, the storyline, and what it means for the Resident Evil franchise going forward. As we said in the review podcast, this is a divisive game. There is so much to talk about today. Let's start with the news. First bit of news, Resident Evil Infinite Darkness. Remember that? Yep, that's due to land on Netflix on the 8th of July. A new trailer was recently dropped showcasing some new footage with new characters, Jason and Shen Mei, as well as a better look at President Graham. That's Ashley's father from Resident Evil 4. Quite a cool little trailer, I thought. The CGI looks very impressive, actually.
Yeah, I mean, it looks visually appealing, Nicholas. Retroactive storytelling, oof.
Yeah, that's a key point. This is set in 2006, so we are in Lost in Nightmares territory. President Graham, as I mentioned, still the president here, so it's post-Resident Evil 4.
Curious where they're going to go down this something happens to the president route again, because haven't we already kind of done this in 6?
Yes, yeah.
Retroactively make Leon look even worse. Yeah, not just one president, but two.
I think one of the big concerns has been, and this is something that we've often spoken about on the podcast, is the impact this could have. It needs to be quite low-key, really, in the grand scheme of things, because something like Terra Grigia, an event that went on longer than the Raccoon City incident, 3 weeks, I believe, if memory serves me correct, is barely spoken about as being, just that random incident that happened in Italy. And it's like, well, hold on a minute there. We had a James Bond-esque satellite take down a city full of BOWs, but it's kind of like brushed away because of the fact that it was done retrospectively. So we've got to be careful that we don't have this big event seen in Infinite Darkness that isn't mentioned at all in Resident Evil 5 or 6.
It's just making what was once a fantastic series recap in Resident Evil 5 absolutely worthless with each new entry, especially if there's as the trailer depicts, a huge attack on the White House. I mean, I say huge, but it looks, fairly large scale from what you can see. And for it not to be mentioned is just odd. There's some nice things they can do. They can start Leon's journey working, under the sort of presidential, sticking to the timeline. There's so many interesting avenues they can go to, and they seem to want to just fill in holes that weren't there. And as the sort of like forcing a new story creates an even bigger hole than present before. I don't know. I'm not a fan of it.
I mean, I agree, and I think this is something we might have to get used to, because I don't know if it's too harsh, if it's sort of lack of imagination or what it is that it seems to be at the moment. The creativity only seems to extend then to, like you say, just going back to sort of revisiting a part of the timeline is almost crammed full. I mean, how many things are going to happen in those years, in the sort of late 1990s, early 2000s? You know, it's getting crazy.
Sorry, GT, I think the big issue is not so much that they want to change things in that respect, it's the fact they want to use these characters in a particular fashion at a time, and the only times they can actually use them are in areas where they're either not being used or between areas they've been used. Because trying to put stuff too much now, the characters are getting much older, and it's harder to. We want to use Leon or we want to use Claire, and it's like means it forces their hands to put it in that perspective. So it's more about the question of whether or not they should even just use established characters and not create new ones, or follow up on characters that we haven't had the chance to follow up on. I think those are better options. But the problem is they obviously want to keep choosing fan favorites, quote unquote, or at least the characters they think are the fan favorites. So they want to keep using Leon, they want to keep using Claire, they want to keep using these characters rather than all of a sudden, it's very rare for them to go, oh, we should pick up that thread of what happened to Billy Cohen after Resident Evil 0, or what about Ark Thompson, or, that's the
I mean, we kind of joke about Ark, but you're right. I mean, this is what we should be doing, because I think, like, even more reason to move on to new characters or these previous kind of side characters, Dario Rossos of this world, because, just how much more you're going to revisit these characters and revisit the same tired narratives.
The frustrating thing is the lack of cohesion as well. It's like the fact that Leon and Claire are going to see each other. There's going to be some sort of inevitable zombie attack. And the first thing they're going to say to each other is, oh, it's just like Raccoon. Even though a year before this is set, they had the big outbreak at Harvardville, which I've put £1 on the table now and say the events of degeneration are not going to get mentioned at all in Infinite Darkness.
My other part of it is it stretches that disbelief level that the same two characters go through all these incidents. You know what I mean? There's only so many times where this duo or this pairing or this group should have to be subjected to the same sorts of incidents again. And you're right, because things won't get mentioned, much like stuff that's happened now timeline wise afterwards won't reference this event or events around it, because obviously it wasn't planned. Still somewhat to keep that consistent, they probably won't mention, or very likely mention, recent events in the timeline that were previous animated films or games.
It's like degeneration ends with Leon saying to Claire, the next time we meet, let's hope it's a little more normal, and now we know it's like literally months later and it's another zombie attack.
An extension of this, though, as well, is what we're seeing. We've discussed this with Resident Evil 8, where some monumental addition to the lore, some may say or may not agree, shoehorned in the 9th installment. And that's what I was talking about, this kind of lack of creativity. Instead of kind of, adding to the narrative in some more cohesive way, we're just given this this huge narrative change, which, hold on a minute, we all know if this were the case, it would have been mentioned in previous titles. And it's the same kind of thing. Just adding something in almost like a thoughtless way that's kind of just retconning everything that went before it.
They've got to be careful. And interestingly, as opposed to, say, like a 90-minute film, this is obviously a series. It's going to be structured very differently. So I'm quite interested to see how it evolves. And do we get some huge epic season finale type thing, and how it feels? I'm worried that perhaps it will feel like it was originally planned as one movie and then split into little bits. I'm thinking the original Clone Wars movie was basically 4 episodes or something stitched together, and you could kind of tell that. But it'd be interesting. I've got a feeling they've planned it, but
I'm quite interested how they're going to structure this in episodically.
Yes,
are they going to pique our interest at the end of each episode with kind of like a Flash Gordon type of someone's just on the verge of death and we won't find it. It's going to get quite cheesy if they're going to if that's going to be repetitive.
It depends if they drop all the episodes at once, because Netflix don't tend to do that if they drop all 13 in one go.
They can't say, join us next week to see if Leon survives. It's like, we know he does.
They know people binge it. They don't always tail end episodes. Like if you watch like the Marvel stuff and that, they're not many of them end on a cliffhanger as such. It just sort of ends, and then the next episode picks up where it left off.
Well, we'll see what happens with that, because that will then probably determine how we're going to do our Infinite Darkness coverage. That does finish gaming news. We quickly move on to site news. We just want to give a big shout out to our new patrons. We haven't done a patron shout out for a while, simply because of the structure of our podcast. So we have a huge number of patrons I want to say thank you to. So big thanks to Aaron Z, Momat, Sergio TX, Albert Whiskers, Brooksy925, Happy Smelly, Umbrella Inc., JC Wesker, MC Milky, Dynamite Heady, Kendo Gunshop, and Rainbow Knight Erosion. Thank you so much for joining our Patreon. It means the absolute world to us and keeps the podcast and the website going. We've got other things coming up soon, so keep your eye on that. If anyone's interested in joining our Patreon, then you can go on our website. You'll find a link at the bottom of the main homepage if you're interested. And just as a new benefit/perk that we've added, should you subscribe and donate and support us on Patreon for 12 months, you will now be a receiver of a very exclusive Resident Evil podcast t-shirt. Our Patreon is now coming up to 12 months old, so the first batch of exclusive rep t-shirts will be sent out to our patrons in the next 4 to 6 weeks. That does finish all our site news. We now turn our attention to the lore discussions of Resident Evil Village.
Long ago, a young girl went with her mother to pick berries for her father, who was hard at work. But the forest greeted them with a dark, cold silence, the bushes empty. Yet determined to find the berries, the rascal broke free from Mother's grasp and vanished into the trees. Mother's worried cries faded fast as the girl ran on, over vine and under branch, and into the forest deep. Feeling strange eyes upon her, the girl recalled Mother's scary bedtime tales, and her throat became bone dry. Then the Bat Lord appeared. He greeted her warmly and bit his own wing. "Come, child, quench your thirst," he said. So she drank the thick, dark blood and smiled with joy. Passing through the graveyard, menacing storm clouds loomed, and the air turned bitingly cold. The girl was shivering in her thin clothes. Then a dark weaver appeared, and with a click of his fingers crafted mist into a beautiful dress. "Come, child, warm yourself," he coaxed. So she clothed herself and smiled with joy. Across waters deep and ominous she went, hoping a boat she found would carry her home. But hunger's grip tightened and her heart grew heavy. Then the Fish King appeared and offered one of his many fins. "Come, child, eat your fill." So the girl ate and smiled with joy once more. Continuing on, she soon entered the forest's dark heart. Then an iron steed appeared, bearing a beautiful golden gear. The creature said nothing as the girl approached and snatched what she thought was another gift. The horse grew angry and summoned the other monsters. Terror filled the girl's heart as the wild wind rose around the beasts. Suddenly, a witch appeared, dark yet regal.
Resident Evil Village. I proclaimed in the last podcast that Resident Evil Village has the best storyline in a Resident Evil game since RE5, and I stand by that. And we'll discuss why I think that. But to get the ball rolling, it's 8 weeks since we played. We've all had a few playthroughs. So where does its storyline and lore fit? I think the best way to go through this, go through the documented events which encompass many, many aspects leading up to the events that we play as Ethan during the game. Chronologically, and I'm sure Batman will interject as well, some of the files are not dated. A lot of the files are dated, so we're trying to hazard a guess as to when they take place, but there are some inferences throughout the files and throughout the game that we can kind of lead on to. What we're going to do is start with Mother Miranda, the main baddie in this particular game, her odd plan, if you like, to bring back her child. So let's get the ball rolling. What did everyone think of Mother Miranda in terms of her storyline, the sad passing of her daughter during the Spanish flu pandemic, I believe, and then her ultimate aim? So, John, we'll start with you. Where did you feel Mother Miranda sits?
Right at the bottom. I think she's one of the worst. There was just nothing interesting about her for me. Yeah, you know, tragic backstory with a baby, but then some sort of magical plot line to bring it back to life. It's just, I just didn't like it. I don't want to be too negative straight away, but I just really didn't like her. She just didn't resonate with me at all. I think she's one of the worst villains the series has ever had.
Well, even taking that kind of sympathetic view as to what she wanted to do, I mean, it's in the same sort of mould as Glenn Arias, that type of personal storyline of wanting to, bring someone back, but bringing the world in chaos. Was there any element of that you felt worked?
The only thing I really liked about Miranda was her work with the connections and how they tied her into Resident Evil 7 with the development of Eveline. Yes, the whole story with Eva dying of the Spanish flu and her then wanting to resurrect her. Yeah, that's fine, but it's like, is this where we've arrived at with Resident Evil, where we've got like a woman who can freely shapeshift, who's 100 years old, who's immortal, and who's splitting babies into 4 parts and sending them off in glass jars? How have we got here from what happens in the first Resident Evil? There was a lot of elements in this game which just have caused this series to jump the shark for me. I did not like the story of this game.
So, Tara, in terms of Mother Miranda, where did you feel that she was with her storyline?
I'm kind of the same ilk, not quite to that level of feeling like a dislike to it as such, but I certainly found it rather underwhelming, and I think part of that is down to how much emphasis they put on implying that there's going to be a big history of Umbrella and things like that. And my biggest problem with characters like Miranda, and like the fact that they've made her like an immortal 100-year-old, seemingly endless potential in terms of like her abilities and things she can do, I just find it hard to believe all this is going on in a secluded little village somewhere, concurrently to like vast global outbreaks and things like that. All the things that all these characters have been through, and there's this unseen threat. It feels so disjointed. I actually think it does more harm than good, unfortunately. And although like I certainly don't dislike Village, I actually quite like it quite a lot. I tend to find I'm more driven with Ethan's story than anything else in the game, to be honest. I think everything else falls far short of like Ethan's plight, and that does include Miranda. And we've discussed this so many times on this podcast, but she's another villain who turns up and disappears in the same game. Commendable work, as John says, to tie the narrative into 7, and I, as we've affectionately started to call it, the lore room. I do like that a lot, and I like seeing all the photos of like Mia and Alan with Miranda and stuff. I think that's all really expertly done, but her as a character and as a concept, I think is weak. I do have to agree with John there, unfortunately.
George, what's your take on Miranda during your playthrough?
Well, I mean, John took a phrase I was going to literally open my little speech with, jumping the shark. How have we got here? And to want to do the game justice and respect the producers involved and to discuss this narrative, in a serious manner, I do find it more and more increasingly difficult. How has Mother Miranda earned her place in the narrative, such a significant role? I just think it's short-sighted for Capcom to think that they can just provide us with this groundbreaking, monumental part of lore in just a throwaway file. Where is the cutscene? Like, for example, in Resident Evil 0 with Marcus being assassinated, it just didn't feel like she earned anything in the series to hold such a significant place. And I think Stars and John have alluded to, it's very difficult to immerse yourself and connect with the tragedy of her losing her daughter, when again it's just another character immediately brought to our attention with this tragedy, which is already over by the time we've arrived. Yeah, I just feel very frustrated because I felt with Resident Evil 7, Capcom confidently knew how this series was going forward. They'd really got things right, and it just feels with this game they've kind of just gone back to the Resident Evil 6 drawing board and just tried. That's why we've got this Mother Miranda character and the Four Lords. They just seem to have just tried to be everything for every man and have thrown so much at this game and kind of spread themselves too thin. I would have liked a more down-to-earth antagonist, and then perhaps we would have had kind of more empathy for her tragedy and seen that tragedy, build up through the story rather than just have it thrown all at us in one file right at the end.
So you're missing it 10 years ago.
Very not.
Yeah. And we've got to take it on the chin so very quickly. That there was no reference of her in the Spencer Mansion, no reference, when we learned about Brandon Bailey. It's very tacked on, and I just think, very, very unsubtle and very jarring.
Rombie, what was your take on Mother Miranda? And then we'll quickly touch upon actually what she did do and why she did it after that.
Nick, you picked a great opening topic for this, didn't you? On the face value, if I take away the complaints that the guys have said, I think there's nothing wrong with the idea of the character. I love the idea of the Spanish flu. It seems relatively interesting, especially in this time and age. I don't think I have problems with it the same way the guys do, but listening to what GT said, I kind of almost think that more hints throughout the narrative about what was going on and why, and fleshing out that backstory, making it feel much more sympathetic along the time. If you had been reading a history, think about the end credit scene and you've got that panel of stuff that's going on. If you got told that story or things to do with Miranda's daughter that took away the names, and then later on the reveal was that the story that you've been hearing about the whole time was the explanation as to why she was doing this.
That would have been brilliant.
It would have made more impact, and I can see the complaints. I mean, I think we have that issue with, it is a lore room. You literally have this giant exposition dump of a room right at the end of the game just to kind of backfill everything, and I think that's the biggest issue. I think if you took the time to craft that information out, and what it makes me feel like is they went, right, we need a bad guy, we need bad people, we need an explanation for this village, we need this, but we don't really care too much about the backstory, and then literally at the last minute someone was like, we should probably fill that in, I guess, and then dumped it all at the end and didn't think about how to actually work that narrative. There's a problem I can see with tonal consistency, which is that they very much want this to be Ethan Winter's journey. They want it to follow his narrative and follow his point. So of course you can't have flashbacks, you can't have this narrative story, and then eventually we get to the Chris Redfield bit, and it's like, well, Chris is going to be the person who finds out information, and there is a massive tonal inconsistency with Chris's character as well in regards to information. But it's that same constant problem. Whereas I think they could have been a lot more smarter about how they drip fed you information about why things in the village were happening the way they were, not just about the four lords, but actually about Mother Miranda, but without actually naming her until the end, when you realize, hey, that narrative I keep picking up about this girl who died, or like the village being impacted by Spanish flu, and like all the stuff that happened 100 years ago has a massive consequence, and that would be a much more interesting way to approach the storyline and make you feel more empathetic towards her, and not have her just be such a one-note villain, even if she ended up being a one-game villain.
And I just very quickly add to that, I just completely agree, and don't you agree that that's exactly, well, a similar version we got of that in the Spencer Mansion with the tragedy of the Trevors, characters that we do see Lisa, but that are off screen, and we get the files building up, so we have that empathy, so that when we finally read, when Jessica suggests to Lisa that they're going to escape, and then that escape doesn't happen, and we read Lisa's revelation that escape's never going to happen, you really feel for them, because that's been earned, whereas with, like you say, this is just thrown at us in one of the final rooms.
I would say, though, I mean, if you look in the graveyard, you find Eva's grave.
Yeah, that's the only counter to it, is that you find the grave early on, which is fine. That would be a great part of establishing that. But imagine if you could find a bunch of files related to that grave, and you didn't quite realize that Mother Miranda was this person, because she was under a different name, or she had a nickname, or, like there was just stuff about the child, and the child's name wasn't so obvious, like things that became a revelation, in and of itself, and kind of set up the story. Like, I can see that being a very interesting connection.
I was just gonna say, I wonder if there's the opportunity for Hag to have played a role there. I know, because you only really see her twice, 3 times, don't you? The last time,
her rambling some backstory, or even that would mean something. I mean, we haven't even talked about, and I know John will probably, he kind of alluded to it, but it's the fact that, like, so she goes wandering and finds this giant thing under the ground, and it just happens to be the cure-all for this problem, and it just so happens to be in this village, and like there's a lot of convenience there too. Yeah. I can see people's complaints with that I have seen. It's.
Do we know though that she lived in the village beforehand?
Well, the grave's there, so we assume that's the case. Like, it's just like you said, the village seems to exist. The only discussion we get is that she went wandering, and it's an awful lot of convenience. You've got these connections to Spencer, who searched the ends of the earth and finds his goal in Africa, and yet she just stumbles down a hole in the ground, and it is awfully convenient, I have to admit.
So we've touched on then that her whole motives were driven by the sad passing of her daughter, Spanish flu, as Rob says, the quite poignant as it happened, given the kind of global situation at the moment. So she has this personal goal to resurrect her daughter, bring her back to life, and then as she finds a cave and discovers the Megamycete. The only question I have at this point is the Megamycete what we see with Chris, that kind of fetus thing? Because there looks to be 2 elements towards the Megamycete. You've got that kind of weird giant fetus thing, but then you've also got, in the other part of the village, the roots that go all underneath the village, which of course erupt during Chris's campaign. Are they one of the same thing, or are there 2 separate organisms?
I think they're all one of the same thing. The Megamycete is described in the concept art, isn't it, as what does it say? It says something like it's a clump of parasites that have gathered together, form this disturbing shape that looks like a fetus, and it's the centre of the mould network, and it's been spreading the roots out for hundreds of years before Miranda's found it underneath the village. And interestingly, one of the reasons Miranda needs Ethan is during the final boss fight, she says she needed Ethan to not only kill her false children, which was the Four Lords, but also to reawaken the Megamycete. So because the Megamycete is essentially this data storage hive mind for all the infectants, I think Ethan killing the 4 leaders of these houses has somehow awakened it and caused it to go rampant, which is why it suddenly starts bursting out the ground everywhere once you've killed Heisenberg.
There's so much convenience within this game that it's very difficult. I found it very difficult to sort of connect, what was lore and what was just happening, because, effectively it just suited the narrative where the writers wanted it to go. And so I wasn't quite sure. Again, the unfortunate timing of our protagonist, they just happened to be in this village when this huge volcanic, organic eruption occurs. So I was curious as to the specific timing as to why. I presumed it had just been growing and growing and growing, and its kind of clone army is spreading and spreading, and it just so happened that was the moment when it was exploded. But I'm really interested to hear that was provoked particularly by Ethan's presence and what he was doing.
Yeah, that's what Miranda says, because Heisenberg is under the illusion that Miranda was testing Ethan by putting him up against all 4 lords to see if Ethan was worthy enough to join them. But I think that was just a ruse, and what she was actually doing was she wanted Ethan to hopefully kill them all, and in doing so stimulate the Megamycete. That's what she alludes to if you listen to her dialogue during the final boss fight anyway.
And I guess that makes more sense than the just convenient timing, as GT alluded to. It's interesting too, because Miranda herself, like during that boss fight at the end, she turns into a extension of the parasitic fetus at the end. It's got like a giant maw with it in the middle, and it creates that shape. The maw creates that shape of the symbol, the feathered wings.
She loses her powers really at the end. I think that's the whole. Isn't
it's almost like she's consumed by it, basically.
I think it's like the V complex in Dark Side Chronicles, that type of thing, or Salazar maybe with the Queen Plaga. That's the impression I got, because I think Rose is reborn, so therefore the creation of Eva failed. I think that drained her of all her powers. I think that's what it's mentioned.
Along with Ethan kicking her ass.
Along with Ethan, yeah, absolutely. I suppose from the lore point of view, there must be something genetically special about Miranda as to why, upon encountering said giant fetus mold thing in a cave, she just didn't become, a lichen, I suppose, or would be a lichen. What's special about her? She must have some special attribute, but that's not alluded to in the games or the files, as far as I know.
That's the problem. That's another reason why I don't like it. Why was she suddenly granted immortality just by seemingly touching this Megamycete, when we know practically the whole Resident Evil series is all about these people struggling to find the key to immortality, and then all of a sudden we just have this woman who in a grief has found this fungal colony and has touched it, and has not only been granted immortality, but she's been randomly given the ability to mimic anything or anyone.
Yeah, shape-shifting.
And there's no explanation for it at all. And you think we took the piss out the way like Paul Anderson has steered the live action films with Alice and the super soldier stuff, and some of the stuff they've done in Village is 10 times worse than that.
I don't want to agree, but I do, because this was my problem throughout the game. I'm searching for explanation, and I'm thinking, well, okay, but Batman will let me know. There is, I'm missing a file, or maybe, and I go back and replay it. But like you say, there is no explanation. And so it's very difficult to connect and immerse yourself in a game when you're spending a lot of the time confused or wondering why antagonists particularly are behaving in a certain way, almost contradictory to what they're saying their plans were.
The issues I have with Miranda as well is the damage that, her presence inflicts upon other titles in the series. One of the things we always praise this series for is when a later game complements an earlier title and actually sort of infers to it in interesting ways and whatnot. This is arguably, a very good link to Resident Evil 7, and it's quite respectful in that. But Spencer's presence, as much as it doesn't bother me like it does some people, the fact that Miranda has achieved immortality, albeit through a way that Spencer doesn't necessarily agree with, it still goes against some of the files you read in Lost in Nightmares, where he's essentially cursing the world and existence for his frail body. And you just think, I know you're driven to using a virus to, shape and, make real your plans. But surely if your body's literally about to give up, wouldn't you just give Miranda a call and just use her method. It just seems like he's going to take this stubbornness to the grave, even though it's the one thing he's cursing the world for. It doesn't tie up all that much, unfortunately.
Hit the nail on the head there. Spencer's minor role is fine for what it is. I don't really have an issue with him rejecting the mold in favour of a virus, because given his goals and what he wanted to achieve when he was a younger man by building a master race, it sort of makes sense. But what I don't agree with, and what Sean means, is the way he seemingly randomly breaks contact from Miranda completely. Granted, he may have believed a virus was more suited to his goals, but given the properties of the mold, it seems hard to believe that in all the years Umbrella existed, at no time did they try and acquire samples of the mold for study, even just to unlock the secrets behind it. And again, in later years, why rely on Alex Wesker to discover the secrets behind immortality when he already knows Miranda and he already knows she's immortal? You know, why send Alex to an isolated island with thousands of test subjects in increasingly desperate attempts to make a virus when he was a dying man and he potentially knew his saviour was in Eastern Europe all along? You know, this is why retroactive storytelling can be a bad thing in some respects. Yes, on the surface it looks to be an excellent reference and a tie-in to the older games, and these are the kind of things fans always gush over, but when you look more closely and peel back the surface, it really does cause more problems than it solves.
You say that about retroactive storytelling, and yeah, it can be effective if done with integrity and appreciation and, you know, loving care for the narrative that went before it. But what I find skewed is that I can't then go from that to then say, and look, you know, that Capcom have done this with all the subtlety of, you know, of a bull in a china shop. But we, like Stars pointed out, you know, before, it's true that video, the production video that shows the love and the care and the attention and just a sincere desperation and love for the series that they do have, the producers do have, and the writers, and we saw in that video. I just again wonder whether it's less kind of insensitivity and more just simply a cultural difference that just, you know, this is a Japanese game, and at the end of the day, I think there's less concern about, you know, breaking those kind of past elements and more just concern about, you know, the narrative in the now and just having a spectacular, you know, narrative now for us all to enjoy and not to look back with the detail that we are.
It's that behind the scenes video it does show and, you know, a passion to want to get it right, but it definitely does come across more in terms of just wanting to make a great game. I don't think we've seen that same level of passion for the narrative. Totally confess that when I went through the Baker incident report and the Brandon Bailey page 41, I believe it is, it's so notable, you know, it took us all by surprise and we were all like gushing as we were, you know, starting to sort of dissect the game. But that's another thing, like Miranda, like the Spencer reference, that once you break it down and scrutinize it, it's so surface. It's just put in there so people are almost disarmed by how awesome a reference it is, that you actually look beyond its problems it actually creates.
We'll get to Brandon and the connections a bit later on, but you make a good point. What I wanted to touch on as well, because it was a nice segue into Spencer, something that Rob mentioned. Perhaps Miranda needed just a bit more explanation in terms of her adaptation, if you like, to the mold. Perhaps she was special. Perhaps she was basically someone like Wesker or even a tyrant host, if you like. That's why she reacted in that way. I agree. I think the situation in Spencer ignoring the mold is valid. I didn't have a problem with him going, this is not what I want for world domination, you know, sod off, that's fine. But what you've also raised is true about Spencer then, you know, bemoaning his bad luck, if you like, and his old age and frailty. Why didn't he just get hold of Miranda? I wonder if there was the opportunity, and I think that's what Rob was kind of alluding to say, actually, she was a one of a kind, because only she adapted particularly well to the mold. Everyone else, all the other four lords, were inherently failures in a different manner, and that's why he didn't want to make that telephone call, if you like. That's why he didn't want to track her down. There could be something there just to make it a bit like I can't call her.
I'd almost wouldn't mind if there was like a further letter where he does actually try to contact her and she basically just refuses him, deems him as unworthy or something like that. And that's in an edition of like Miranda's diary that you can find. You know,
coming with the DLC.
Spence tried, you know, has contacted me wanting the secrets to immortality. You know, I've deemed the old fool unworthy or something. You know, just something that implies that he did actually try at the 11th hour. But they don't do that.
What we've got to remember, though, is that for hundreds of years, for hundreds of, you know, 100 years or so, there's nothing going on in Eastern Europe. You know, the village is fine. You know, there's just the castle, and there's just, you know, 4 crazy people living there doing their experiments. There isn't an
Lycan stronghold still up and running, isn't it?
There's a Lycan stronghold, yeah, but obviously Miranda's keeping them all at bay for experimentation purposes. and so forth. So, but there isn't that kind of outbreak. It's a very controlled and contained little thing going on. So, it's not on the world stage. It's not like, oh my god, there's this huge outbreak going on, that kind of thing. So we've got to remember that as well. The shit only hits the fan when she gets Rose, and then the plans then come into focus. I just wonder whether that there is a bit of scope there to expand upon why Spencer didn't want to pursue with that, because I think in his old age he could just go, give us a bit of mold, and that'll at least give me another 200 years to find to become the god that I want to become. But Rob, is there anything you wanted to add about that point?
There's nothing inherently wrong on the surface value of what it is if there was more care put into expanding this with a bit more thought. But I mean, yeah, as GT and Sean also alluded to, it could be just down to the fact that the focus is on making this a good game with a consistent tonal story to 7, and the greater lore concepts were not as important. But as I kind of go back to, like, that lore dump and like the exposition at the end is not very good storytelling. It doesn't engage me on a good level where you literally come into a room that tells you everything that you've been missing out information wise at the end of a game. That's not good game design either.
Enough. Remember Evelyn and her power over them all? Rose is her successor. No. Rose is Evelyn's true, complete form. She will grow to fully control the masses. And I must have her.
Fuck you, you crazy bitch!
What I want to move on now to is to discuss two elements here: the mold / Cadou and the Four Lords. So Lady Dimitrescu, or Dimitrescu, however you want to pronounce it, Heisenberg, Moreau, and Donna. But yeah, so I want to talk about like the actual application, if you like, of the mold. So it's very different to what we see in 7, and so I want to park what we know about 7 and how Eevee work, and just purely focus on the lore that's established in Village about how this particular mold works, because as we know in the files, there's a clear difference between Eastern European mold, the original mold, Megamycete, and then the connections synthetic-esque mold, or the Dolby mold, as I like to call it. So as long as we keep them separate, we can then discuss how they kind of work with each other, because that's a big discussion as well. But in terms of what we see in the game, there's discussions in the files about brain affinity, I think. Is it functionability, something like that? About how the Cadou has interacted with the functioning level of its host. Now, if you haven't been functioning well with the Cadou, you tend to be a lichen. If you have a high functioning ability and affinity, I think is the term they use, then you're more likely to have better powers. That seems to be the general gist that's put in the files. So, should we just go through each of them, starting with everyone's favourite vampire? Because I think, John, you'll probably correct me, I think we've probably got the best details about her as to when that happened. I think we're talking the 1950s with Lady D. So what do we know about her and how she became 9 feet tall and seemingly able to take any form of hit from a gun?
Well, Alcina's clearly, I think she's the oldest of the Four Lords. I think the file that talks about her assimilation with the parasite, she says she's 44 years old, and we know from the Maiden's Diary she's in charge of the castle in the late 1950s, so at a guess I would have to say she was born around the sort of 1910s, something like that. She's not originally from the village, is another thing we've also told, but she obviously belongs to House Dimitrescu, which has its origins in the village as well. What's interesting is the whole vampirism thing was explained by this hereditary blood disease she has, which is why she needs to drink human blood to maintain her health. But out of the Four Lords, I think she's the second best adapter behind Heisenberg. She doesn't age. She's grown to, 9'6", and she's got these retractable sort of claws. What is interesting as well about the Cadou parasite is they seem to have the ability to transform into their monster form and then back to human form. I noticed when I was playing the other week, when Ethan was fighting her when she was in a dragon form, she says, only Mother Miranda has seen me in this form, which I thought was quite interesting. And likewise, we see Moreau mutated as that big fish before we see him in his normal form. So I think that's quite interesting how they can seemingly mutate back and forth at will. Alcina's probably the most well-developed of the four, but I still don't think we know enough about her.
Who says Resident Evil 6's Simmons mutations are far-fetched, eh?
Yeah. So, yeah, Alcina has this hereditary blood disease. And what I liked about her was that need for blood then led on to the lore that's surrounding the slaves and the Samrak, I think they're called the Samak, flying gargoyle things in the castle. And I thought that was quite a nice little connection, draining the blood, the river of, the beds of blood, if you like, under the castle and all the wine and things like that. It's almost like her larder of blood, but she gets very excited when a new blood comes in.
Again, parts of this game that just feel that Capcom went down the wrong road with the Resident Evil 6. They just didn't learn the lesson from that. Is that we got so much more detail, it felt, and they just felt so much more depth to the Mother Miranda backstory. Take those fantastic files that we've got with the artwork of how her daughters, metamorphosed from, human bodies into flies and back again, the little backstory we've got with that, which was fantastic. But it seemed like with each Lord, it kind of the story and the narrative and the BOW that went with that all kind of got weaker and weaker and weaker, with I feel that Moreau right down at the bottom. And it almost just felt that, and again, they're just spreading themselves too thinly. And if perhaps they'd just gone with the two Lords, I just think it would have been a lot better. It just feels almost so top heavy, Mother Miranda and everything that she brings to this narrative when compared to, say, some of the other Lords.
Lady, you mean Lady D?
Yeah, Lady D. So yeah, Lady D. Yeah.
Yeah, you make a really good point, actually, because there's quite a lot of information contained in the castle, especially with her daughters, and that's a cool file about the bugs. There is actually quite a lot of information when you combine it with the Maiden demo and those dates, because I think you can work out that the Maiden is Ingrid, I think.
Yeah, that's right. Her name's missing off the file in the Maiden demo. Is it the observation report or something? Ingrid's name is missing off that in the demo, so it implies that, yeah, she is the maiden who's captured.
You pick up Ingrid's necklace as well, so you fight her in the main game.
Yes, you do. Of course you do. Yeah, that's true. As one of these slave things. But again, that lore was so cool, because it's like they're literally like drained of blood, and then they're given the Cadou, they're given the mold, drained of their blood, and then they're just kind of these weird zombie-like things, and they're creepy, and it worked really well. And then the flying gargoyles are a nice expansion upon that, and that really works. And what George says is true. It does go a bit, I would say, downhill. Because I don't think that's fair, because I think each Lord brings their own flavour to the game. But the explanations do become a bit weaker.
I think some of the earlier, obviously you under the concept art that it's unlockable and stuff, and some of the backstory stuff thought about having in and then decided to cancel are much more engaging than the ones they went with. They went with a much more simplified option, so it may be a time frame thing, because it was obviously the whole thing with Heisenberg's family and
Beneviento. I think is a good example of that. The whole backstory
as well. Yeah, backstory.
Oh, there was a huge whole thing to Beneviento. I mean, it made me just think.
Family.
Yeah, if we just had the castle with Lady Dimitrescu and perhaps Donna, then it would have just been wonderful, and because they could have expanded, for the greater horror, that Silent Hill element, and then perhaps for more of the adventure, we could have got the village leading to the castle. I don't think we needed the Heisenberg and the Moreau. I just want to be just make quick this point, because I have sort of pointed out a lot of things about this game that fell short for me. Capcom did a lot right with this game, and I just think that, these are frustrations. Like you said, they're not necessarily criticisms; they're just frustrations that there was a template and some atmosphere and narrative that was just wonderful within this game. That I just think, with a little bit more care and explanation and a little bit more focus, and maybe keeping more to the Resident Evil 7 frame of just being more kind of minimalist and just focusing on a more simpler story and fleshing that out, and things could have been a lot better.
Going back to Lady D as well, though, there's some quite cool artwork. I think in the games on the back of some of the pictures of the Cadou being administered. She's laying in the bed. Not quite sure what size the Cadou is. It seems to vary.
Yeah, the ones in the jars are quite large, aren't they?
Yeah, but then it's kind of implied that it's these parasitic, microscopic. Quite unclear as to what precisely that one is. There's a picture of Mother Miranda, an image of Mother Miranda administering Cadou. I assume to Lady D when she's in bed.
Well, the whole Cadou thing itself is a little bit underbaked, I think. John might have some more comments, and Sean as well, but it's a little bit confusing in regards to so it's a compressed parasite version of the Megamycete, but for host consumption, but it kind of ends up being like a miniature version, but it's not very well explained. I think that's my understanding. Has anyone got a better explanation than my understanding from the actual game?
I think you're right there. It's not explained very well at all. I think the Cadou, it's created by exposing a variant of nematode to the Megamycete, which infects and digests its tissue. These nematodes are then genetically tinkered with and spliced together so that when they mature inside a host, they essentially look like a miniature version of the Megamycete, which itself itself is described in concept art as a giant clump of parasites that have grouped together to form this sort of embryo-like image. I think the Cadou parasite works as some kind of stabilizing agent to stop the mold from running riot when it's exposed to someone. And because these nematode parasites thrive in soil and wet environments and feed on bacteria, fungus, living tissue and dead organisms, therefore they have so much DNA in from many different creatures, this could explain the diverse range of mutations we see in the game. And the parasites, I think, can also be artificially manipulated to produce different creatures as well. But you're right, Rob, there's just not enough information about what exactly it is and what it does. We just know it was created to give Miranda a better chance of finding a suitable vessel for Eva.
Isn't it only one reference when Mother Miranda makes the point that it's a more efficient way, and it's just her ability to find a vessel, in the short time. Well, just in terms of you just needed to test a greater range of test subjects in order to find a vessel, and I think just use the word efficient.
I assumed that was so that she didn't have to drag each test subject down into these underground caverns and get them directly implanted. But yeah, I got that part, but beyond that, it wasn't. Yeah, there's not a lot of explanation.
Because I wasn't sure if it was effectively just nothing more than an effective, administering tool, and so it was just like a shell and nothing more than that. But it's interesting to go beyond that and think that the actual biology of those parasites.
Well, it might be exactly what you say. I'm just speculating here because the game just doesn't tell us enough about them.
It's the best explanation for. So one thing that really bugs me in the game is that huge disparity and range between the mutations of the Four Lords.
Yeah, we'll come back to that. But also, this was my understanding of the whole purpose of the Four Lords was to find the vessel. That was their job. That's how I read the files. It was like, here's the Cadou. You can do what you like, and they did to help that process. So Lady D was taking people from the village, experimenting on them. We saw Moreau doing what he wanted to make the lichens. He was having lots of fun doing that, and Heisenberg was doing something similar with his making them more mechanical, which I know he was trying to plot against Miranda, but there's no way he could have done all that without her noticing what he was up to. So I'm assuming that there was this belief by Miranda that they were all doing these experiments to help her find that vessel.
Yeah, I think so, but I don't think she really expected any of them to succeed. I think she basically just kept them alive as her children because they were the most successful candidates she had to date.
I mean,
I don't think she particularly cared about them. I mean, she planned on Ethan getting rid of all four of them because once she had Rose, she had no need of them anymore.
Again, I wasn't sure if I was missing something. There didn't seem to be a lot of explanation as to what worth they had, other than kind of she was referencing them as her children. So I wasn't sure if she kind of had this motherly, genuine connection with them. But I wasn't quite sure as to why she was keeping them alive. And then in terms of wanting to finally see their demise, well, surely she could have dealt with that herself pretty easily anyway.
Maybe it's part of the test, in of itself. Like if Ethan is worthy and therefore Rose is worthy by being Ethan's daughter, if Rose is as good as she expects Ethan's probably going to dispatch these other false lords. I
think a lot of what we're saying here tonight proves there is a great game kind of underneath all of this, I feel. And just again another example, people that fans, I don't want to get fans to be disparaging, but those that really do sing the praises of this game, perhaps look back, like John says, how have we got back to this point? Look at the file we got, the Keeper's Diary, and how that chronicled the very kind of slow descent from human to zombie, and that's how we got an explanation as to what the T virus does, and so we know, and then we see that personified in the zombies when we play the game, and you could compare that to what we get in Village when Moreau says, I stuck something in their bellies and it turned into a werewolf. I mean, what explanation other than that do we get as to for the lichens being like that? And that's the equivalent, Resident Evil 8's equivalent of the Keeper's Diary.
I don't mind that. If that's what I go with, as long as there's consistency.
But where's the explanation? That's what I mean. In the game.
I would say that's just what the mold does. It turns you into a lichen. I can accept it. It's more of a reason. So if we'll skip Donna for the time being, but look at Moreau. If you actually look at his file in the lore dump room, it actually says he has low brain affinity towards the parasite, which is exactly the same terminology that was used for the lichen. So why did he turn into, a walking, talking fish, and why didn't he turn into into a lichen? All the others all had quite high brain affinity towards the Cadou, which is some explanation, part of an explanation as to why they didn't become a lichen. It doesn't explain how they became what they did, but at least they didn't become the basic enemy. So why didn't he turn into a lichen, and why did he turn into a rather sad, pathetic little fish man? I don't know.
Well, this is what I mean. Maybe the parasites can be artificially manipulated. I mean, Moreau says he infected someone with a Cadou and then injected them with wolf's blood, didn't it? Further enhance the sort of wolf-like qualities. And, the Cadou hasn't worked in Moreau clearly, but maybe Miranda kept him alive simply because his mutation was so drastically different. The thing I like about Moreau as well is he's completely useless. He has no skills. He doesn't know what the fuck he's doing when he's experimenting on people with the Cadou, but he just does it anyway out of blind loyalty to Miranda and an attempt to please her. He spends his time hiding in the reservoir, watching romance films and eating cheese, and just randomly experimenting on the villagers with absolutely no clue what he's doing. And that was something I kind of liked. He's got all this power, but he's basically nothing more than a child trying to impress his mum.
But there's actually that's a good point. I was laughing, but no, because that could have been fleshed out. If there'd been more time and more.
The thing is, GT, I don't think everything needs to be fleshed out. I mean, this is the thing. I get what you were saying. I don't mind a lack of information for some of the lords. I don't mind a lack of information for some things. Like, he's fine. There's nothing wrong with him. I don't mind it. It's just a general consistency to the overall narrative that I think we're all having this overall problem with. I mean, more is always better, I guess, most of the time. Like, you can never complain about having more, but if there's some things are lacking, like if there's a lack of information, it doesn't, to me, it's like, yeah, there's 4 different lords, and you're right. What you said before was probably true in that, like, because they spread themselves a bit too thin, there's a lack perhaps for some of them, but that's okay if there was a tonal consistency to the upper level of stuff that was there and had enough explanation to explain it. That's it. I mean, you can have a lack of information, but you just want tight stuff that for the little bit that is there. So
the only things that don't get any form of explanation really are the Arias brothers.
Much like what we've just been talking about and the way that the 4 lords reacted, these particular brothers just had a particular type of reaction where they kind of went down the wolf path, but because they were still strong, brutish brothers, they kind of became that version of themselves. I didn't really need massive more amount of explanations beyond that. I just make that assumption based on the outcome of all the other experiments. Like, I could be wrong. That's just headcanon, but it seems to fit that.
It makes sense. But like the gargoyles, the Samak are explained, the slave ladies are explained, the zombies are explained, Lady D is explained, the Dimitrescu daughters are explained. Whether there's a bit of consistency, but there's quite good. I always felt, compare it to say Resident Evil 6. Which doesn't have any explanation until you properly dig into what the C virus.
Clearly, the virus has had so many variations because you just didn't know what you were going to get.
Yeah.
Like that, because it's just like, well, that's how the virus works. That's okay as well, because that's viruses in general. Everyone, like if you have a common cold, everyone gets slightly different symptoms or gets impacted heavily by certain things based on their physicality. So I never really had too much issues with that. And a fundamental idea I don't have any. The core concept of this, that everyone reacts differently, is kind of interesting too. Like, I don't mind that either. But
let's talk about Benevento and Donna. Her affinity to the Cadou and what she can do seems to mimic she has almost like a special relationship with those yellow flowers that kind of grow outside a house, which can cause hallucinations in people. We see that Gardner's file is is really quite cool, I thought, as well, when he got to go back and almost visit his wife, I think, if I remember correctly. She can control these hallucinations, but then I think the files mentioned that she almost splits the Cadou between herself and Angie the doll.
I had some problem with this, again, how did she split the Cadou?
The way I read into that, and you guys might see it differently, is that essentially mentally she has in that way that the hallucinations work, people think that's the case. Because the way it's described when the villagers are talking about it, it's almost as if she's talking through the doll, which is very straightforward, that she's using the doll as like a trauma vessel. But realistically, I think what we're actually seeing is just a hallucination of her splitting the Cadou between them as if they were two personalities. But realistically, it's just her.
So she's just kind of using multiple dolls as that vehicle, you're saying?
No. She's still just got the one doll. I'm just meaning that she is continuing to use that extension of the doll, but when you're in the hallucination form, it seems like the Cadou is half split between the doll and her as if they're two entities. But I don't think she physically split them. I think she's just like her personality is split between herself and the doll, and she uses the doll to talk outwardly. Thus, the same applies when you've got this hallucinogen added, that the doll seems to be its own entity. And it's confusing because I say this, but then you've got the scene at the open church earlier on, and she's walking around by herself and going, giggling and waving at you and stuff. So who knows? They just wanted a creepy doll. Clearly, that's really what the intent.
Exactly what it amounts to. And the hallucination angle is really weird as well, because this game infers that you need these flowers, you need to sort of breathe in the pollens or whatever to become victim of these hallucinations. Yet Resident Evil 7 already establishes that the mold gives you hallucinations, because isn't that what most of the game's denouement is? As Ethan's going back through the guest house, he's hallucinating all of Mia attacking him again, and tonally it's exactly the same as the early Beneviento stuff when you're walking through the graveyard to get to the actual house. It's all presented in exactly the same way, yet for some reason they've added this additional subplot that you need the flowers to see these hallucinations. And I suppose in Village's defense, at that point we don't know Ethan's just pure mold, but it's still quite disjointed.
You suggesting there that if he was pure mold, then he wouldn't have had the hallucinations? Because, like you say, that's the thing that jarred for me, is I couldn't quite understand what the significance of the flowers were, and why particularly why Donna herself had such a particular ability with them. It didn't seem to be, again, any explanation as to anything about her prior life that would have caused this relationship, or as to why, after being administered, with the mold, she then had this relationship with the flowers.
No, the flower thing is explained. The bit that I get from the flowers is that the grave, she planted this particular flower that she obviously liked around her child. I think it's her child's grave, I'm guessing, because of the age of the child. And it just so happened that flower had to happen, this particular ability. Maybe she didn't realize when she planted it, but she obviously, once she realized, cultivated this, because it's the only area that those flowers exist, is literally around that grave. Now, the interesting thing about that part is whether or not the flowers themselves are the hallucinogen, or it's something to do with the child's grave itself. Now, that's a more interesting story to me, but
it's Donna's mutation. She can secrete a pheromone.
Yeah, that's what it is.
Which controls these plants that are infected by the mold, and that's what brings on the hallucinations. Yeah, so she can secrete the pheromone to stimulate the plants, which brings on these visions.
That seems quite a complicated thing in terms, but like you said, like Sean says before, when we already had that reason in the narrative for those hallucinations, we see them on the boat. When we're seeing.
Yeah, but are they saying that this element of the mold is the cause of it in 7? If you like, is this part of the mold? This is the origins of the hallucination aspect of the mold. I don't know. I'm just spitballing here. Is that what they're trying to suggest? You remember the hallucinations in 7? This is what caused it.
But then to add to the question, like what you were saying, John, with the secretion, has she created an actual flower that creates that thing for her? Because obviously those flowers exist and they are glowing a certain yellowish color, and then she's planted them around her child's grave. Is that part correct? Have I established this the right way?
I thought it was that the flowers had that ability to begin with, but then she had the ability to extenuate that and then spread that and control that, which made me think, it just seemed, again, a matter of convenience that there happened to be these flowers with that, with that ability to begin.
Yeah, the other way around is less convenient. More that she, to me, if she bred these flowers and cross-pollinated them with her own ability, that would be less convenient. But I see what you're saying, GT.
Those specific flowers contain the pollen that brings on the hallucinations, but she can stimulate the plants so long as they're infected by the mold, by this secreting of, I don't know what you'd call it, pheromones, some sort of signal-producing pheromone, which stimulates the plants to release this particular pollen, which brings on the hallucinations. And I'm assuming the pollen causes hallucinations because the plant is infected by the mold. Again, it's all very vague.
It's all vague. Exactly the words I was about to use. I didn't think about the fact that obviously having a mold connection would be interesting, but again, it comes back to what GT said, which is, again, we don't know how, but also the convenience of it.
So can my theory work that the hallucination element you see in 7 with a Dolby mold, could that possibly be...
Possibly, I mean, if it is explained as John's just said regarding that there's a connection to the mold in regards to the flowers and the hallucinogen, and also obviously the controlling of it through Donna, then yes, probably it could be a byproduct of the mold because it has spores, because it has...
Yes.
Yeah, it is a possibility, but it's never confirmed. It's just again another assumption or a vaguity of the whole thing.
It's a nice bit of headcanon that may help with dating.
The timeline's impossible in this game. It's one of the things I find really frustrating. I mean, if going back to the Four Lords, I think, like we said before, I think Alcina is the oldest one, likely born around the 1910s. Heisenberg also mentions he's been trapped under Miranda's leadership for decades. There's nothing about Moreau, and Donna appears to be the youngest because the gardener's diary file states that she received the gift of power and then planted these flowers next to Miss Claudia's grave, and I believe she died in 1996. So It's got to be some time after that. So she's quite recent compared to the others.
The span's like about 100 or so years, but there's very little dated, isn't there?
Yeah, and if you look at the, I think it's the experiment notes file where it talks about Alcina's implantation with Cadou, a nice little reference is the other subjects mentioned, part of the Beneviento and Moreau families as well. I think it's Bernadette Benviento and Mahai Moreau who didn't take to the parasite, and one of them died and one of them just became a lichen. So she's been experimenting on these 4 families for years. I think these 4 families are descendants of the original 4 founders of the village as well.
I think that's what they were certainly going for. Let's talk about everyone's favourite electric Magneto yielding boss, Heisenberg. Sean, I'm going to let you lead with this one.
The Frankenstein army Tetsu guy.
Yeah. I have to say, I mean, I don't know one really likes the factory, but in terms of the storyline that's kind of going on, I found it a really fascinating element of the game. And Heisenberg, I found an interesting character. Someone mentioned, would it have been more interesting if Heisenberg was stalking you throughout the factory, which I thought would have been quite a cool concept. But in terms of what he does, again, we get such great explanation in the actual design of like the Soldat and the jet Soldats and Sturm and things like that. They almost don't need a lot of explanation because it's visually quite clear as to what they're trying to do, and yet they give it. You get some great environmental storytelling with some of the X-rays and whatnot, and there's some cool logs and the tape recording of Heisenberg doing some experiments with the Soldat. That's really cool. That's really good stuff. So I very much enjoyed and actually tolerated quite well the stupidity, if you like, of jetpacks, monsters coming at you. Where I got a bit funny was obviously with Heisenberg himself. Now, I think the official law on this is upon implantation of the Cadou, he developed an electric organ in his body. Answers on a postcard, please.
That's funny enough.
But I mean, it eventually becomes a magnetic coil, yes.
It does. I mean, I say that. I mean, just as I'm speaking it, I'm thinking, how different is that to the TNG virus?
You say that, Nick, but I don't remember Morpheus, swinging boats around the fucking air and.
No.
Great reference to T plus G virus. But yeah, we had that, didn't we, with the electrical properties of that? Yeah.
But then thinking about it again, the Albinoid was, I suppose, had electrical.
I was going to say, I don't think people would have minded it so much if it was one or the other. If it was some mild electrical abilities to pick up and throw stuff, or it was him just tinkering and making these weird creations, but it's kind of like both is perhaps too much. Plus the fact that the factory section
he's a full blown ex-person. He's Magneto, isn't he? He basically commands the stage exactly the same as Magneto does.
It's practically identical, isn't it? Where he's throwing the knives into each of the Lord's posters on the wall. Yeah. Whoever developed Village is clearly a big Fassbender fan, given the Alien Covenant lab at the end as well.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, that's neat though. I didn't hate the factory, Nick. I'll just point out quickly. I actually quite like the tonal change of pace, and it just basically plays like Doom. At that point, it's just a full-blown first-person shooter. So I was on board with it. It was fine.
But that is a massive tonal change from the rest of the game.
He's being sarcastic.
As we've said before, it tries to do it like what Resident Evil 6 did was it tried to promise it could do all these different avenues, and it failed so terribly at giving you a survival horror section and a pure horror section and an action section and a pursuer section. And I actually think Village does it quite well. I appreciated the factory after, the sort of shenanigans with Moreau and things like that. And I just like the fact that it did just go full blown. I don't like necessarily the enemies, and I certainly don't like the Heisenberg boss fight. But I like the aesthetic and the combat and the pace and the flow of the factory. I felt it was all right, actually.
You didn't think it dragged on a little too long, though?
First playthrough, it does.
No, I don't think it did, because I tend to play these games at a fairly fast pace anyway. Even though I like try and soak in all the environments and everything like that, and I'd certainly take my time reading the files and that. When it comes to the combat, I am very much more, anyone who's seen me streaming it might be very much more of a run and gun kind of person. That's one of the reasons why I struggle so much with like Remake 2, is because you've got to take a more sort of laboured approach to how to disarm the zombies and things like that, and that's why I struggled.
I don't fundamentally disagree with anything you said other than that, probably, because I just found there's too many corridors and too many windy rooms that are all very similar now. But I can see the Doom comparison there, or at least the old school Doom anyway.
In terms of what Heisenberg was up to, though, he gives quite a lot of explanation. Well, he was obviously quite unhappy with his role as subordinate to Miranda and was making the soldats in order to raise an army against Mother Miranda, fully aware that she could crush him at a moment's notice. He was quite open to her power, should we say. So asked Ethan for help, because obviously he was able to dispose of quite a few other BOWs along the way. So that was quite an interesting subplot.
I was going to say, I think the thing I find the most frustrating about Heisenberg is the fact that on his wall that he likes to throw the knives to and everything like that, there's so much additional lore detail that you just don't get a chance to see. And unless you've essentially either data mine the texture or freeze frame the game at key points, you don't even realize that he's summoning the BSAA, which he's scrawled in a big marker pen over one of the maps or something like that.
If you don't click on the X and you crouch and look up, you can actually pretty much look at the whole board. Yeah, you need to know beforehand. So as long as you don't click on the command button on the curtain itself, you can kind of duck to the gap to the side and peek in, and you can see the whole thing.
Seems things even like a photo of Chris, isn't there, and stuff like that.
Yeah. There's photos of Chris and his operatives. There's a thing about the BSAA. There's photos of all the lords all crossed out. There's a big picture of Miranda on there. Yeah,
going back to what you were saying, Nick, Heisenberg's a really interesting angle that I wasn't expecting the game to pull, actually, trying to strike an alliance. I don't know whether I'm frustrated or admirable of Ethan for sort of throwing it away, because I tend to be more interested in what would have happened if he'd embraced Heisenberg's offer.
Because it's not out of the realms of possibility, because he was talking about, I don't give a shit about your family issues or stuff like that, and it's hold on a minute, listen to what I say. Clearly don't want Mother Miranda, you clearly want to stop her. Well, Heisenberg's clearly more powerful than you. Why not, even fake an alliance just to take her down? There's logic in what Heisenberg was suggesting.
Heisenberg says he's going to use Rose to stop Miranda, but in what way does he actually mean by that? That's one thing that is abundantly not clear. At least I didn't get any kind of concept as to what he means.
My assumption is based on the information that we get later in the end of the game when we see the adult Rose, that she has abilities, and considering, as it's been pointed out, there's something on the flasks themselves that say if she's not provided with a certain thing, she'll age quickly, that perhaps he was going to recombine her, let her age, and then influence her in the same to take down Miranda. But it's a vague guess based on the circumstances.
He says Miranda's scared of her, so I actually think that's why she loses her powers really randomly at the end of the game. It's something to do with Rose. Whether Rose could control the mold at that stage, being an infant, I don't know.
Or is it that the Megamycete provides her with the abilities, it transfers all its energy towards Rose?
Yeah, possibly, yeah. Because she's meant to be the perfect version of Eveline, isn't she? So maybe the Megamycete at that moment, left Miranda and transferred into Rose. I don't know. Again, it's just not explained, and that's the frustrating thing with this whole bloody story. Heisenberg's plan, anyway, he was going to obviously use his metal army to go against Miranda and call in the BSAA. And I think he obviously told the BSAA about the location of the Megamycete as well. If you look at his little map, he's drawn all these handmade bombs right above the same site where the Megamycete is, where Chris goes in. So I thought that was interesting.
Going back to the Rose thing, though, I get the feeling that this is an intended trilogy of games. I think 7, 8, and 9 are a trilogy. I definitely think they're going to pick up this Rose storyline much more, obviously, than they have with, say, the Revelations titles or anything like that, the way it ends.
No, I hope so. I'm all in favour of continued storylines, and go back to my original point. I still think this works quite well with 7, and we'll come on to 7 in a minute, because that's obviously opens up a whole new can of worms.
Can I just ask a question, actually, that we haven't mentioned, that it does get raised in the game, but there's no answer provided, and I'm assuming I haven't missed anything, but there's the whole thing about how just before the Megamycete scene with Chris, they have a conversation about who let Miranda know about Rose, and one of the team members says a moldy little bird, but doesn't imply any more direct connotations as to who that actually is. Who let Miranda know about Ethan and Rose and Mia?
I've seen people online suggest that it may have even been Chris in order to lure her out, but I think that's a bit of a... But again, people are making these kind of, grabbing for these explanations because, the game just isn't giving us any.
I get that because people have raised the point that obviously the BSAA/Chris moved Ethan, Mia, and now Rose to a town that's very close, conveniently close to where this village is. So I can see where that assumption might come from.
I think she just found out about Rose via the connections, I think, because she'll obviously be fully aware what's happened in Dulvey, and I think the reason Mia and Ethan had to go into hiding is because the connections were obviously looking for them.
And it's just a massive convenience that the BSAA happened to move them, not that far away.
Yeah,
well, possibly. But I think Chris has maybe done it on purpose to using them as bait. I think he says at the start of Chris's gameplay section, one of his soldiers says she's been doing recon in the village, and that's how they've found out what Miranda's plan is. And because she's a shapeshifter, I mean, I'm just speculating here, I could be barking up the wrong tree completely, but because she can mimic everyone and they can't pinpoint where she is, Chris has potentially moved Ethan and Mia very, very recently to this house in Eastern Europe. And he's obviously watching the house and waiting for Miranda to make a move, which she obviously does. Aside from a massive convenience, that's the only reason I can possibly think of as to why the BSAA would be that stupid.
I mean, I like that, but then it then jars as to why he then just shoots up the entire property when really all he had to do was just take Ethan to one side. Look, I've got something. I've got good news and bad news. But it's just. I mean, we've not gone into that, have we? As to why, Chris, no.
To be fair, if I was Chris and I knew what Miranda could do, I'd probably do exactly what he did. I don't think I'd go in there talking. I would just shoot her the first chance I got.
You really have to stop worrying.
It's just finding you in Louisiana, the pregnancy, Chris moving us here, military training, it all happened so fast,
Well, at least we're all together. You, me, Rose. Now, everything's gonna
Seriously? Think we can just forget about what happened in Louisiana?
It happened so long ago. I don't understand why you are so...
Mia, get down! Mia! Mia, oh God!
Chris? What the hell?
Sorry, Ethan.
No!
What? Why?
That bit kind of makes sense, but it's the bit afterwards where once he's been eliminated, but he could now actually tell Ethan what the deal is, but he decides to be a dick. But of course, that's just because game narrative, that's movie logic. You just have to have it for conflict. I get it, but the problem I have with that is that at the end, when the team calls Chris out on it, he kind of doesn't really have an excuse, as if the writers themselves couldn't come up with a good reason for it.
You joke, Rob, but I actually totally think that's why that line's been put in. Absolutely. It's almost like they realised like narrative issue here. So let's just have one of his teammates chastise him, and then the fans will overlook that. I think it's a great little thing.
We lampshaded it, so therefore it's justified. Yeah.
Before we kind of leave the BOW element, there's a question I wanted to pose to us all. Do we see in this game evidence of pure mold in action, or is everything affected with the Cadou? I suppose the biggest question is Miranda infected with the Cadou, or is she purely infected with just the mold?
No, surely the Cadou comes after it. The Cadou comes because of what Mother Miranda wants to do with the mold.
The game implies as much too, Nick. So yeah, Miranda's 100% mold. And as I said before, like that whole thing at the end when she dies and it seems to absorb her, and you see basically another version of the Megamycete with the maw mouth kind of thing folding out. Yeah, I would assume that's 100%.
It's also worth just mentioning here at one point, we've talked about nematodes a couple of times with reference to the Cadou, but this is actually something that's only featured in the Japanese version of the game. So if there's people confused as to exactly what we're talking about, nematodes are microscopic worms, I believe, John, I'm right? Microscopic worms that form the Cadou or something like that, yeah.
Worm-like parasites that live in like soil and wet environments. They feed off things like fungi and mold, so it obviously ties in quite neatly.
But this is a reference that is totally omitted from the English version, so it just must be said for clarification, because we've used it a couple of times in reference to the Cadou.
It's something that's added to the Japanese version, because everything is written in English first, as far as I'm aware, for all RE Engine titles. So it's something that was added for Japanese release as opposed to ignored for localization.
That's a can of worms, Nick.
It is a can of worms.
Yeah, that's a can of roundworms or nematode.
But going back to your point about pure mold being used, Nick, the sort of storyboards at the end of the game show that before she created the Cadou parasite, Miranda is basically implanting the villagers with mold. And again, this is another link to 7 because it seems to give them, initially anyway, regenerative properties. Seems to heal them from this Spanish flu. Yes. And this is the whole reason why they come to view Miranda as a saint, and she starts to refer to the Megamycete as the Black God, and the villagers slowly turn away from their own religion and start worshipping her as this kind of deity. And that would all be really good if it wasn't just a complete rip-off of Resident Evil 4, like so much of this game is.
Yeah, at the same time, just that's still a great narrative that would have been fantastic if it unfolded during the game in game files. And yes, we do get the kind of the same montage at the end of 4. You get as the artbook in the Incubate guidebook, and it's fantastic. But it's kind of just putting an extra layer onto a narrative that we already know. But whereas in 8, it completely serves as the explanation, but we only get it at the end.
Yeah, I was going to say that's the big difference between 4 and this, is that 4 kind of starts to give you that implication through the game somewhat, and then really ties it off at the end. But this doesn't give it at all.
So what we're saying is that the much maligned RE4 has a better narrative than Village.
No.
To end on.
No, I'm not going that far. I'm not going that far. When it explains the whole thing, like what I was saying before about you create a narrative through consistency over the tone, so you get hints of it, which you do. I mean, you get the murals on the wall and the pictures of Miranda and all this sort of stuff. That's all there, but it doesn't give you any explanation. You have to fill so much of the gaps yourselves. Whereas the occasional more file that kind of hinted more towards what happened 100 years with the Spanish flu and what Miranda's position was and how she was a savior to the village, those things could have been put in there, and for some reason they're not. There's not enough of it. So
those storyboards, though, don't they imply that yes, she cures people of Spanish flu? Don't they then turn into a lichen?
Sometimes, yeah.
Is there actually any difference between someone who's infected with pure mold or those?
No, I don't think it does. I think, as George was saying before, it's just a quicker vessel to implant. So it just makes the process easier, but it's no different. It's just a facsimile option, a faster option.
Could it be, though, because this is what we do see in Village in the great scene with Elena and stuff, is that the Cadou is spread as it is, just like a virus, with old Leonardo's bitten, isn't he? And then transforms into a lichen. I wonder if that's what the Cadou does, more so than perhaps mold. If you're attacked by someone with mold, would you then become infected?
Who knows? Again, it's not explained.
The only thing lays eggs in its host, so maybe when Leonardo's bitten, some of these eggs get transferred into him and hatch and subsequently grow into a Cadou parasite. I don't know.
Mold spores, these worms things, maybe that transfers. Who knows? We don't know. I mean, the other implication that is brought up but doesn't really get explained is the fact that Miranda protects the villagers from these monsters, which implies that while she's creating them, she does try and keep the villagers isolated, and because obviously she needs villagers to experiment on, and she has to wait for villagers to procreate and create more villagers to have more test subjects, so she can't have them all being killed. So she obviously does keep all this kind of in check as well, and has done for 100+ years.
I think that's where the stronghold comes in.
Yeah, they're keeping them all in there, yeah. But occasionally, obviously, they get out and wreak havoc, it seems. But especially of late, she's basically abandoned them, but that's just because of Ethan's arrival and Rose's arrival. She said, I don't need to worry about that bit, becomes clear, but beyond that, yeah.
So just thinking about it, going back to our preview podcast of Resident Evil Village, we spoke about how awesome it would have been if we arrived in the village when everything was okay, and then all hell broke loose. We were quite close to that, but I think what we've kind of discussed this evening, there was a good opportunity actually to have seen total carnage.
The frustrating thing is, Nick, I think a lot of that's on the cutting room floor.
Yes.
The first trailer does depict life in the village before the incident, so I think we were due to see all that in an earlier build. And for me personally, it's heartbreaking that a lot of this, if people go back and watch the original reveal trailer for Village, you will see an entire trailer full of villager sequences that are not in the final game, and a lot of it is life before the carnage, as you call it.
I think what was unsettling for me, with this part is you arrive and all hell has just broken loose. We've just missed it. That's where we're at. But there looked to have been, with the arrival of Arias, almost like an established hierarchy almost in place very quickly. And we know Arias wasn't in the stronghold or anything like that. He was just the village chief. I think that's what it says in the concept artwork. That was the plan. So he would have been attacked quite early, and then for whatever reason, as we discussed, he then mutated into, Big Cheese, Mendes style, and then just almost took command, if you like, of the Lycans. And the Lycans, listened to him or followed him, or the bells or whatever caused it. It just seems that was established quite quickly, and we missed that. That could be DLC. Who knows?
Well, I got the impression he was infected some time ago, and he was just. I didn't think he was recently infected.
Okay, maybe. Same with Otto at the mill.
I can't even remember what happens at Otto's mill to me.
The giant X-Man. But of course there's more than one X-Man anyway, because there's another one when you go back. If you go back to the
grave, yes, yeah.
The grave, yeah. So I think it's just they just exist. They're just big X-Men because it's an enemy variant.
And there's the one who's guarding the Megamycete as well. He's obviously been there a while because that's his job.
That's true.
He's kind of entombed. He's almost semi-entombed into the wall at first.
That would be arguably then quite good DLC. Right. Well, I think that's a good explanation or attempted explanation looking at the Cadou mold within the Village universe. We're now going to expand our horizons a bit. We've already spoken a bit about Brandon Bailey saving the law once again, or at least in theory. So this will be a quick discussion before we get into Resident Evil 7, which I think a lot of people want us to discuss. So a reminder for people, Brandon Bailey was Marcus's chief student, was he not? And one of the key scientists involved with the progenitor virus, and up until Village came out was, a high-level employee within Umbrella, and helped Marcus with his progenitor investigations. In fact, he helped link in with Resident Evil 5 and the Lost in Nightmares files quite nicely all the other games, and made 5 that pinnacle of, I think, storytelling in terms of, connecting all the dots. And there he, as Sean alluded to earlier, he then suddenly appears, bringing everything together. Or does he? John, how did you feel Brandon Bailey fitted in with this?
Well, like most people, I was taken in by it at first. I thought, oh, that's brilliant, Link. But then when you think about it, it just doesn't make any sense. I'm pretty sure that if Capcom had announced prior to the release of Village that the leader of the Connections was a minor character from background files in a previous game, I'm pretty confident absolutely no one would have guessed Brandon Bailey. If you read the files from 5, Bailey isn't painted out to be this major rival to Spencer. He's just a student of James Marcus who spends 30 years at the African lab shipping out samples of progenitor to Umbrella's labs across the world. He loses all interest in his work when Marcus dies and describes his feelings as being completely indifferent to what happens with Raccoon City and the mansion and the African lab being shut down. There is absolutely nothing in there to suggest he wants to seek revenge by masterminding his own crime syndicate. He writes his last journal entry in November 1998 where he actually says he believes it's too late to have anything resembling a life again. And yet by 2000, the connections are up and running, have established enough not only to have reached out to Miranda and gained her trust enough to convince her to hand over both samples of the mould and Eva's DNA, but they're also in league with the rival company, Albert Wesker, and receiving technical cooperation from HCF. You know, considering the lengths Spencer went to have progenitor and its source a secret, why didn't Bailey exploit it for the connections? Why wasn't he performing experiments with the mould and progenitor? I mean, look at the efforts Wesker had to go through with Tricell to find the African site when Bailey, you know, his business partner in 2000, one has to assume, had access to it all along. One has to wonder why Bailey was retroactively chosen as leader of the connections when we know that as of 2006 he's dead. You know, ironically killed off by Spencer to preserve the secret of progenitor. And even more ironically, in that same bastard file that has Ethan W in it, that fueled all those... Ethan is quite obviously an Umbrella researcher prior to 7.
Yeah,
despite ignoring the large word dead written right next to his name. That fucking file is haunting my dreams.
The Japanese version, I do believe, of one of Brandon's files in 5, though, doesn't end on quite such a nonchalant note. I do believe in the Japanese version, feel free to correct me, he does say something like, now is perhaps the time to strike, or something like that. It might be worth verification on if you get a chance to...
Going on to that file, I was going to say, the thing about that file is that you can retcon that file pretty easily. You can say that it was a falsified file to draw attention away from his actual plans. So that's not a non-issue. That bit's a non-issue because you can change that. He could just have filed a false file. But yeah, there is other bigger issues like the timeline connections, or unless he didn't trust Albert Wesker, but again, you have to go then explain that. And then the obvious one is the death thing has to be overcome, which is pretty big.
I mean, John gives a really good, law articulate answer to it. I can't add anything other than it just, so much of it doesn't work. It generally feels like Capcom just kind of just threw all the names in the Resident Evil series into a hat and literally just came up with Brandon Bailey. And what's a shame, because, you know, for people like me that don't necessarily connect with the gameplay of Resident Evil 5, no one can kind of discount the fantastic files and particularly their value to the narrative. And I mean, subject to any slight translation difference in the Japanese file that alludes to, you know, Brandon Bailey wanting some type of revenge, but like you said, there's so much. Rombie points out as well, there's so much more to it that it's completely nonsensical. I don't know why they went with this name. It's almost slightly insulting to the fans that they just felt, you know, we'll pull a kind of a retro feeling name from the past that had some connection to Spencer, and we'll just, you know, look how clever are we. It's very cheap. If you actually, like you say, you dig under the surface, none of it makes any sense.
In the Japanese, he just says, I think it's time to go, or, you know, it might be time to move on. It certainly doesn't allude to fucking forming a crime syndicate and going on a rampant revenge.
Which yeah. I'm gonna be devil's advocate. It also doesn't not.
But 6 a.m. You're in a very good and forgiving mood. Bloody hell.
I'm just saying, like, that file part is not really the issue. The bigger issue is the dead part. That's the file can be falsified. The file can be changed. The file reference can be made untrue. Like, he was covering his tracks. That's a non-event. But there's the big issue with the connections, Wesker, and then the death thing. I think are bigger hurdles to potentially overcome when you start digging in.
That is an issue. Are we expecting Brandon Bailey to turn up in Resident Evil 9, or at least more mentions of him? Because as Batman said, he's dead in 2006. The same year, I believe, Blue Umbrella reformed.
So he faked his own death. Is basically what we're implying when Blue Umbrella, or he actually did die, and their tech brought him back from the dead, and it's Albert Wesker all over again.
Who knows?
Everyone's assumption on Phoenix with the IX is correct. It just wasn't Wesker, it was Brandon Bailey all along.
You know it. Chris is going to run into the Blue Umbrella headquarters, going to turn around, and it was I, Brandon Bailey, all along.
If you actually check the options screen on Revelations 2, it actually spells out Brandon Bailey if you go down it all.
It was Brandon Bailey all along. Outside. I did see that post that people pointed out. Did you see the option screen on 7?
I don't buy it for a moment.
It was hilarious. It was hilarious. It was very funny. It doesn't matter. It wasn't probably planned, but that is pretty funny. You have to admit.
I think it's incredible how much this community will reach and grab something wholeheartedly without thinking about it first. Yeah.
Let's talk about the connections then. So it's because a lot of this information, by the way, if you haven't picked it up, is in the Baker file document.
They may not have read it if they didn't get to the file because they had to pay money for it.
It's shocking. Please do not pay for it. Google it, find it.
I mean, DLC paid issues aside, the Baker file in itself is really, really good, and it's something Capcom should do a lot more of in the future, I think.
Can I bring up the elephant in the room about that file? Am I allowed to talk about this? That I mentioned as soon as I was like, what the fuck, with Ethan?
Go on.
My question is, if Ethan died in his mold and there's this connection, what does it mean for Zoe and her existence within the Baker family? And is she human? Is she mold? What's going on there? And what's the deal? Like, I'm super confused by this whole thing.
Well, she was cured.
Yeah, but then, yeah.
The way I read it is the Bakers were just infected with the mold. They weren't killed, they were infected. And one of the symptoms of mold infection is if you're subsequently killed after you're infected, you can regenerate to a certain extent. And certain individuals, like Jack, have more regenerative powers than others. So they could effectively be cured so long as the infection hasn't took them over completely. They could, in theory, be cured and become normal humans again. Whereas I think Ethan's unique because he was flat out killed, and then Evelyn had to infect him with mold and resurrect him as a molded, essentially. Albeit an extremely unique one because he retains his human form. But again, for gameplay reasons.
I understand that point. That point's fine. But if the point of Ethan being killed, we presume, is when Jack punches him out. Yeah. And I'm not going to. I know it's a minor point. I'm not going to use this that we can sort of see from Ethan's point of view as he's being dragged away. But if we take it that okay, he was killed then when he's punched out, but wasn't Ethan infected by Mia prior to that in his interaction with Mia?
We don't know. It's never made clear when Ethan's infected. We don't know. If he was infected and killed, that would make him no different to any other character in 7. Therefore, he would not be special.
So it had to be that he wasn't infected during that interaction with Mia.
Until after he was killed, yeah. So
that thing with when Zoe's sewing his arm back on.
We don't see it. That's the thing. That's exactly what I was about to say, GT. So what happens is you've got the armed thing's already happened during the fight with Mia, and then when you wake up in the chair at the table, it's reattached. So the implication is he either Jack killed him, or basically Jack knocking him out, he bled out and died.
Yeah.
And as he was being dragged back to the main house, and then when you wake up, technically Ethan is dead.
And then at what point was his arm reattached by Zoe?
Probably during that time that he's passed out, because when you wake up at the dinner table, the arm's reattached.
But then Zoe didn't need to reattach the arm, because if he was completely dead and then resurrected as molded, why wouldn't his arm have reanimated without Zoe needing to reattach it?
His corpse was still intact, wasn't it? Minus the severed arm.
And you get that implication from the fact that when Lady D cuts his arm off, it starts to get with her, basically. So,
and the files in 7 make a point that even though you've got regenerative abilities when you're infected, it says severed limbs can reattach. So when she puts Ethan's hand back to his arm, it'll reattach. It's not the same as he can't grow new limbs. Like in Village, for example, the lichen bites off his fingers at the start of the game. His fingers never grow back. But if he got his fingers and tried to reattach them, they would have reattached. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Thank you.
It's the same with Ethan's leg. If you get that scene with Jack and
So there's 2 points I want to make. There's always been that assumption, and George kind of alludes to, that Ethan was infected quite early on, either, and you can always pick and choose, can't you? Either as soon as he enters into the guardhouse. I always had him down as being infected when he bumps into Andre's head, I think, in the water. I thought that was the point. Or some people thought, when he first encountered Mia. Again, all perfectly viable. It didn't matter. Now it seemingly does matter, because as John says, if he was infected then killed, then he's no different to the other characters, but he is clearly special. So I think what we have to assume now is at no point was he infected with the mold until Jack killed him and Evelyn went, oh shit, I need him as my new daddy. And she infected him, and lo and behold, he actually came back as effectively a superhuman, give or take. So the suspension of disbelief, therefore, lies with the fact that he was able to cope quite miraculously with having his hand pinned up against the wall, crucified, basically, and then chainsawed off.
The problem I have here is that we're discussing the difference, but at the end of the day, it doesn't, for me, have a particularly significant bearing on the narrative, because when Evie says to Ethan at the end, "Oh, didn't you wonder why you were surviving?" We already knew. Well, in our minds, we thought we knew why he was surviving these injuries is because he was infected with the molded. We just, the only difference effectively is the degree of infection, and the point of infection. But it's actual, the gravitas of that revelation wasn't as much as it could have been. It could have been a real sixth sense moment. You were a ghost all along, but actually it wasn't really a stunning revelation what Evie was saying to Ethan, because he was special, but that specialness didn't really add anything to the narrative, because like I said, we weren't, it wasn't a jaw-dropping moment then, because Lady D had already impaled us with her claws, and I kind of thought, well, why is he still living? Oh yeah, he's living because he's infected with the mold. He's just got no regenerative power. So I don't know if you guys were feeling that it was a degree of infection and didn't really have that big powerful moment that it could have, that sixth sense moment that it could have been.
Well, yeah, I kind of see where you're going from. That kind of does make sense. I mean, you assume that because of what happened to him in 7, he had some abilities granted to him. The death thing was perhaps the extreme end of that. I wasn't expecting that, but it didn't have the impact because of that reason. I can see what you're saying.
There just doesn't seem any point to it. Why not just have him as a human and have him save his daughter and then die as a human? It just didn't really work for me, to be honest.
I guess the point that they're trying to make across is obviously to explain more about Rose between the two parents, because if Mia has been cured, as the narrative assumption is based off the events of 7, then the only way that the baby could end up being the specimen is if one of the parents was part mold. So they had to explain it somehow, so I guess that makes sense. There's a hint earlier in the game, which most people miss, which is, I didn't see it either until replaying a couple of times, but which is when Ethan's hand gets dropped off. If you examine the hand, you can actually see mold inside the limb itself.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
It's also, I think, it obviously used as a vehicle to explain away the sheer amount of brutality Capcom like to inflict upon our guy Ethan, and it creates incredibly strange conundrum with what they try to do with the character of Ethan. And I think it actually works against the idea of the character. And the idea of the character was, as they've spoken about in Resident Evil 7, was that they wanted to kind of make Ethan an avatar of the player, which is why you never see his face. And as some people like to point out, his characterization in 7 is not quite as in-depth as you would maybe expect from this series. And that's fine. The problem is, if they wanted Ethan to be an avatar of the player, you put yourself in the shoes of this character, they create a world where he's maimed and brutalized so much that I feel personally you can't empathize with him in that kind of level. You can obviously empathize with him with regards to a father looking for a child, that's fine. But I don't think many of us have been impaled through the hand and strung up, into the ceiling of a large room and had to forcibly tear our hands through the hooks and things. It's an interesting conundrum they've created with this character, to be honest.
But then also, like you say, they kind of try to imbue him with more character, and it almost feels like, that's very much what he was meant to be in 7, an avatar for the player. But it doesn't feel like that at all in 8. And again, it just feels like they're almost confusing themselves, Capcom. They're not quite sure what they're wanting to do, and they're kind of finding themselves down a rabbit hole. I mean, I find this again with the way that they've included the merchant into this narrative, but they've wanted to connect it a bit more. So we get the Duke. And you say that line before where Capcom weren't quite sure about, Chris's motivations, almost calling themselves out. I felt they were calling themselves out again with the Duke when he says himself, well, I'm not, Ethan asked him, who are you? And I'm not quite sure. I don't think Capcom themselves know. I actually liked it when the merchant, he was just mysterious enough and kind of went with the aesthetic of 4 so that he didn't jar when he was stood with that mysterious blue flame just to one side outside of, a save room cabin. And he didn't impede on the narrative enough for me. But the Duke, so I won't go on a Duke criticism here, but just very quickly, I felt that again with another example of it just wasn't quite right for the game. A jolly jester in a save room doesn't really do it. And at the end, when he says, well, I'm not quite sure myself.
He was going to be the 5th Lord, wasn't he, at some point?
Yeah, he was, yeah. I will say that despite all the criticisms we've pulled at Ethan not being a human as such and being a living molded, I will say on a personal point of view, and it's just me, I'm not speaking for you guys, for all the problems that idea and narrative beat creates. I do love the sequence with Ethan and Evelyn. I think it's one of my favourite pieces in the series in terms of how it's directed, presented, acted. The music I think is phenomenal in that moment where he's on like the snowy wilderness and Evelyn's before him. I think that, and you see the flashbacks to Seven and everything. I actually think Todd, I forget his surname, who plays Ethan, does great work in this, and I love that sequence so much. But I'm fully aware of all the problems that Ethan being a molded, I say in inverted commas, creates with the narrative.
You're dead.
Dead? I mean, Miranda. She... No. I still have to save Rose.
Wrong! It wasn't Miranda. You were always dead.
What are you saying? I can still...
See? Miranda didn't kill you. You mean you didn't think it was weird? No matter how much you got hurt? Remember. Years ago, the Baker house. You were murdered by Jack. You died there 3 years ago.
That's impossible. No way.
You shouldn't even be able to walk around.
Quit messing with my head.
You shouldn't be walking.
Screw you!
I do think the game really does make 7 as a game far more important. And for that, I feel it has dragged 7 very much into the main line, which was a criticism of 7, even after the DLC.
But I think it does that perfectly fine without this Ethan nonsense. Because if you go on any message boards now, it now says, well, if Ethan could do this in Village, what does this mean in Resident Evil 7? What does this mean in Resident Evil 7? You know, it causes all these unnecessary problems, whereas the good stuff, i.e. the stuff with Miranda and the connections, to the point where they've taken stock photos of Evelyn's being experimented on in Resident Evil 7 and then superimposed Miranda's face on top of it. You know, that stuff is excellent, and that's like proper old school Resident Evil. And I just wish they'd done more of that, because that's a brilliant way of making the story of Resident Evil 7 more important and better, rather than this whole Ethan thing, which doesn't work. And I mean, I wouldn't be so critical about it, but I can't, having played the game several times now, I can't understand the point of it. There's no payoff to him being this revelation that he's been dead for 3 years. And that's my biggest criticism with it. There's no point to it.
There's so many questions that come as a result of it. It's like, you know, you're under the impression that Mia has had to undergo many tests to sort of validate whether she's still infected with the mold or not. Rose has obviously had a number of tests as well to make sure she's okay. And you're telling me that no one has done any kind of survey on Ethan to see how he's doing? You know, would this not have been abundantly clear?
But Mia knew.
Yeah, but how does she know?
No, she knew he was special. Like, okay, is he okay?
Yeah, unless everyone who was infected with the mold in 7 knew Ethan was dead.
And that's a secret she's kept since 7, yeah.
But then you'd think Zoe would potentially know.
Exactly what I was about to say. Zoe would then know, and that would be the implication in her file too, but of course they weren't going to put that in the file in case you read it before you played the game.
But of course we're giving no explanation, are we, as to when and how Mia found this out? And how she found it out in a way that didn't involve Ethan himself also finding out.
Well, there's lots of little things like that we don't know, like also how long Miranda was in place of Mia in the house, other than a little while because of Ethan's comments and his own little comment about Mia's snappiness.
I always found it interesting, I've said to you before as well, when you first play the game almost suggests that Ethan gets reinfected with this mold. There's prolonged looks in that first cabin of him looking at his hand, blood, he's covered in blood. It's really...
I think that's just because he wasn't expecting blood and there was a blood trail and he's like, what the hell? I don't think that's the
I don't
reinfection.
know.
If anything, it would be more the lichen bite that would have made more sense.
That's what I said. The blood, the lichen bite, and then the bugs under his skin as well. I thought that's where they were going as a kind of this is the explanation as to why he's going to survive the inevitable.
But they could be
mauling.
red herrings for that purpose, knowing that later on they knew narratively that he was always going to have been dead in the first place. So for you as a player, yes, that could be all.
You're not alone there, Nick, because Chris thought Ethan was potentially reinfected by Miranda. That's why he basically abducts him as well at the start of the game.
That would have made more sense as to why Chris didn't say anything, but they don't explain that. Like, that would make 100% more sense why he doesn't trust Ethan with the information.
True, and but then also when Mia says, "Oh no, he's special," why does it make any difference? What in terms of what she's trying to say to Chris about it?
I think Chris is just like, oh, he's dead, we're just going to leave him. And then she's trying to say, well, no, he's already dead, so he can't die, he'll come back to life.
But she didn't know he had his heart ripped out.
Yeah, which I'm assuming's obviously bought him extra time, but he was always going to die from that moment on.
Yes, that was a Mortal Kombat fatality, I think.
But then maybe he's not. Dun, dun, dun.
He's hovering by this grave.
Oh, no.
That Netherworld scene with Evie, I think one of you guys actually mentioned to me in the chat that this was kind of just a symbolic of where Ethan's mental state was at the time, or almost explaining to him what he was going through. But are you saying that Miranda pulling out his heart was a fatal injury to that molded reincarnation? Or...
Absolutely. It's one of those things that I think if you'd reinserted the heart back into his chest, it would have healed. Right. And, the same way his legs and feet reattach and stuff. But I think it's the only thing and I do like this from a narrative point of view. The only thing that keeps him going is the quest at this point, and then that's why. And it's a moment I love, and I really do think the character of Ethan's done well in this regard. The moment Miranda's dead and he's finally got Rose back in his hands, he just drops to his knees and he's done. He's finished. I really like that. I think that some of the imagery is wonderful in that moment. It's borrowed time.
I agree, but I just think if he'd suffered fatal injuries as a regular human, it would have worked just as well.
Yeah, I don't disagree. Yeah, if it'd just been like a abdominal stab or something.
Well, they could have said that as a leftover of his old infection 7, he has minor powers, and that would probably be enough to.
I mean, there's rooted truths in that. When someone says that someone's trapped under a car, and all of a sudden someone just finds the strength to lift the car enough to get the person out from underneath it, or something.
That's a proper thing.
Yeah, and I think it's that same mentality thing that the mental fortitude can sometimes overcome some extreme situations.
As far as we know, there is no planned official guide coming out for Village yet, which may yet fill in some blanks. We could get some DLC with regards to that, so keep eyes open and we'll obviously keep people updated. The other big element of Village, especially with Chris, is in relation to the BSAA and their sudden defection. Not sudden defection, but their use of biological soldiers.
I'm sorry. Captain. You need to see this. BSAA didn't send soldiers. This is a bioweapon.
What the hell were they thinking?
Orders, Captain.
Pick up the rest of the squad. Plot a course for BSAA Europe HQ. Someone's got to pay.
One of the big twists at the end of Village is that when, I think it's Tundra, I can't remember, one of the Fox Hound squad, they capture one of the soldiers at the end.
Fox Hound.
Fox Hound. Wolf Hound.
Welcome to the Metal Gear Solid podcast.
Wrong franchise.
To be fair, I did have that mental image in my head when they did say Wolfhound the first time.
Yes, anyway,
it's like they're gonna have code names like something Snake and.
But yeah, the reveal is that BSAA are sending in biological soldiers or enhanced humans, which is really interesting because it took a lot of people by surprise. But if you were familiar with Umbrella Corps, and I think we're all now very much regretting not putting it in our essential list, it would not have come as a surprise at all, would it, Batman?
Well, I think it's interesting, and not so much the genetic soldiers, but I think the way the BSAA are suddenly described as a rotten and ruined organisation, I think is very interesting, because it's a very dramatic twist, and the lack of Blue Umbrella in this game is very telling, I think. Chris has been disillusioned with the BSAA ever since the Dulvey incident, according to the Baker file, largely thanks to the botched mission to capture Evelyn in October 2014, when the connections were transferring her from their base in Munich to Central America. Although we don't know the specifics, the BSAA's failure during that operation is essentially what leads to the whole Dulvey incident, and it's probably fair to say that Chris's disillusionment probably also extends to the BSAA's working relationship with Blue Umbrella. Now, to give a bit of background, as Umbrella were reformed, the UN imposed a number of conditions. They had a moral obligation to dissolve units like the USS and the UBCS because, as a private organisation, they're banned from having their own in-house paramilitary forces. And yet, despite this, the UN still expected them to be able to provide on-site support to any biohazard site anywhere in the world within 24 hours. But this kind of sanction naturally puts Umbrella in practically an impossible position when you think about it. But when you take into consideration the incidents the original Umbrella were responsible for, their reformation would never have been allowed without such restrictions and precautions in place. Blue Umbrella complained to the UN about this very issue and spoke of humanitarian considerations being taken into account when expected to send their own employees to dangerous field sites unarmed. And the UN's answer to this was to provide armed support via the BSAA. And this results in the formation of the unit we see at the end of Resident Evil 7, BSAA elite operatives using Umbrella-made weapons and equipment. So in terms of Village, and the BSAA now being described as a corrupt organisation, what does this mean? First of all, Umbrella and the BSAA are clearly still working together as of the events of Village. Chris's team have Medi injectors stamped with the Blue Umbrella logo, and the crate ammo supply drops are another Umbrella idea, detailed in the Tokyo Maru books. Politically speaking, the United Nations needed the cooperation of Umbrella. UN forces had yet to establish the means to counter the growing complexity of BOWs and was subject to severe criticism from other countries. Other things as well, like the ballooning operating costs of the BSAA and other organisations, were also attracting criticism, and the fact that Umbrella offered to pay the costs and provide the technology made sense. So it was quite unprecedented, really, that a United Nations subordinate organisation was stationed in the hands of one company. And since then, Umbrella has devoted itself to expanding the power of the unit. So on paper, it sounds like a proper honeymoon relationship, but something seems to have gone wrong somewhere. And I think that during the time since 7 and Village, the BSAA have become more reliant on Blue Umbrella and the tech and the anti-BOW weapons and the finance they provide. So reliant, in fact, that I think Blue Umbrella have started to influence policy. You know, the BSAA were already under severe criticism from the UN member nations for failing to develop promised anti-BOW countermeasures following incidents like Langshan and New York and Vendetta. And coupled with that, their working relationship with Umbrella was originally a secret until Blue Umbrella were named as an official investor in the BSAA, submitted to a public hearing at a British Parliament. And this was widely reported in global media and again contributed to the public becoming mistrustful of the BSAA. And a lot of people were questioning the true nature of this relationship between the two of them. So I think it kind of parallels what happens in Resident Evil 5. If you think of Tricell manipulating the BSAA during the events of what happened in Cadou, you know, you had Excella as a GPC board member and Tricell as an investor. They had a great deal of influence over what happened to the BSAA during that mission in Cadou, and I think the same's now happening with Blue Umbrella. You know, if you think about it, if Umbrella really want to stand at the top of the world again, then the BSAA would be their only major obstacle, so weakening them from within would be the logical step to take. And if you think back to the events of games like Resident Evil 5, 6 and even Vendetta, you know, the idea of the BSAA using bioweapons as cleaners would be unthinkable. These genetically enhanced soldiers that have been deployed to the village are almost certainly a Blue Umbrella creation, yet they're wearing BSAA patches on the uniforms. You know, if this revelation was made public in the media, again the consequences would be disastrous for the BSAA. And Umbrella, because they work behind the scenes of all of this, would not be implicated at all. You know, case in point is the Dulvey incident itself. The unit was made up of Umbrella-made equipment that were flying around in Umbrella helicopters with the logo on. and boats with the Umbrella logo on. Yet according to the Baker report, the BSAA have been solely blamed for everything that happened, and Blue Umbrella are not even mentioned. You know, even Chris, an original 11 founding member, has no knowledge of these bioengineered cleanup teams, and also seems to have been sidelined to the point where he's basically had to go rogue from the BSAA. And this again indicates that the top brass of the BSAA are being manipulated by Blue Umbrella. So hopefully the reason Umbrella have been not mentioned in Village at all is because they're purposefully saving it all for a big BSAA versus Blue Umbrella versus the Connections showdown for the next game. And, you know, such a scenario, if you think about it, would be a perfect swan song for all the classic characters.
And indeed, like Blue Umbrella's only reference in Village is making life-saving med injectors. So how good does that look to the public eye?
Exactly, yeah. So I think it's all quite cleverly done. I mean, again, I'm speculating. None of this is. It's all based on what the information given in the Tokyo Maru books, but you know, it seems a logical direction for them to go down.
I just want to say that was fantastic. Thank you.
It was fantastic. I mean, it's ridiculous that Capcom, you know, shouldn't have to rely on someone with John's ability to break it all down. That was wonderful, but it's frustrating, isn't it? You know, as fans, a series that resonates so much with such a large community, it should be more accessible. That information should be a lot more accessible. I mean,
let's break down the numbers. I mean, like because most of that information comes from the Tokyo Maru books that came with BB guns of like the Thor's hammer, is it, and the Albert model. So how, like, if you're talking like, you know, we joke about the Baker incident being locked behind a paywall, but this is 10 times worse because these guns are literally what, £300 to £500 in like English money.
Yeah, but hopefully Capcom are learning a lesson, because information like the Baker report at one point would have all been hidden away in a Japanese guidebook. Yeah. And for once they've actually included it in the game.
And putting things like the concept artwork.
Yeah, it's worth saying that the concept art in this, you know, like you've already mentioned, Nick, a little while ago, that there's no like behind the scenes book or concept art book, but really, like for the first time in this series, all the notations and everything that the concept art gets in game is like a concept art book equivalent in this case, isn't it?
It just goes to show as well how important all this behind the scenes stuff is, because playing the game, I mean, why is Chris so pissed off against the BSAA? It's never explained. One of my favourite images in probably the whole series, because it looks so beautiful, is when Chris and his team are overlooking the village at nightfall under the full moon, and you can see it on fire and you can see the battles going on, and he zooms in on the BSAA who are deploying soldiers into the village, and he's like, oh, fucking BSAA, they've gone too far this time. And it's like, well, what the fuck do you mean? You know, they're the good guys. The game doesn't explain at all what's going on. You have to unlock the concept art and scroll through it all, and it says, oh yeah, by the way, the BSAA are now a corrupt organisation.
You start getting hints of that by the end when obviously the reveal during the last cutscene with Chris with the genetically modified soldier, but do you go, okay, so something's weird's definitely going on, but yeah, it doesn't explain anything.
I did like the BOW soldiers being almost like an advancement of the cleaners you see in Survivor. It's that same sort of concept, isn't it, of having these disposable members able to go into these areas, sort it out, and then leave.
Yeah, and yet if they get found out they're wearing BSAA uniforms, they're not wearing Umbrella uniforms, which I think is really, you know, really clever, because it'll get the BSAA criticised for using such things. And Umbrella, who are basically developing bioweapons again, can say, well, no, we're using it to deter bioterrorism. We're using these beings as soldiers to kill bioweapons. So they get away with it scot-free.
It is good, though, that, again, this goes back to why I personally enjoyed the storyline a lot more, is that we are getting a recurring villain, if you like, in the sense of Blue Umbrella. And I do wonder if this is Capcom's attempt to remedy the fact that we never got what arguably we were promised by the end of Resident Evil 2, 3 and Code Veronica, with that kind of Umbrella takedown. And I'm not including Umbrella's end at all in that. I just wonder if this is their attempt to go, right, we'll remedy this, we'll build it up, but this time we're going to make it bigger and better. We're going to have the goodies against the baddies against the other baddies, and we're just going to go all hell to leather.
2021, I'll never forget it. And suddenly the BSAA stock prices crashed.
No, we can't go through it again.
For all intents and purposes, the BSAA was finished.
You've got the Connections as well, so you've now got 3 groups: Connections, Blue Umbrella, and the BSAA, which all need resolving.
Yeah. One of the most frustrating aspects of the narrative is obviously, we've excitedly spoken about a number of times, you know, the big HCF reveal in Resident Evil 7. and we're looking forward to that being elaborated further. Oh yeah, it's not.
Well, it is in an indirect way, isn't it? We got more information about the connections. You know, they clearly haven't forgotten about that they're not a throwaway like the family were. So I think we can take some solace from that.
I actually think they're going to tie Ada Wong into the connections, because she was supposed to be in this game spying on the village. So that could be a hint that she was at some point, or is at the moment, working for the connections.
With all these additional lore elements, you know, taking the HCF reference in 7 into consideration, John, has your opinion of HCF changed at all, or do you have any clearer idea who they are?
I don't really think they've ever been properly developed, have they? I mean, I don't think we're ever going to see them again. I mean, I was as surprised as anyone when we got that reference in 7. As much as we all hoped otherwise, I think it was only ever meant to be a nice homage stroke Easter egg. I don't think it was meant to be this big plot hint that they were going to come back in a big way. They needed an organisation for that time period, and they thought, oh, do you know what? HCF, the fans will love that. But because we were all desperate for information on them, we all hoped that this was going to set the scene for the big comeback.
The fans will love that. Seems to be like their approach with all the little references and the Spencer file and the Brandon Bailey thing, doesn't it? And, you know, in some ways, like, trying to appease a fan base like this is sometimes the worst way you can tell a story, I feel.
Yeah, no, but it feels as superficial as that. It's just, oh, the fans will love this, but without actually really thinking it through as to how they're going to construct that into a narrative. And I think as fans, we wouldn't want to be patronised. We would rather play, you know, an engaging narrative that makes sense logically and expands the series forwards, that doesn't have any back references. Or if you're going to have them, have them that are intelligent and make sense.
I'm ashamed to admit that it works, because, like, you know, if anyone could have seen the look on my face when I was reading the Baker report and got to the, you know, the now legendary page 41, the first thing I did was literally just dropped. My jaw just dropped. I couldn't believe it. You know, that they've seemingly woven all this narrative together again, and I thought, absolute genius. But unlike the sort of mind-blowing revelations of Resident Evil 5 files, this doesn't hold water to any kind of level at all, I don't think.
I think they've got to be careful. I know what you're saying there, George. But then, you know, if they don't put any lore into it, then it just becomes Resident Evil 4 again. And that wasn't particularly exciting for the purposes of that game. Whereas Village has made a concerted effort. You can see that they've wanted to tie Resident Evil 7 in much more to the mainline series. And I think they've done that. I think they've achieved it.
Question I have to ask you, Nick, is have they done these references as a knee-jerk reaction to the hardcore fan base's criticism of 7 for not being linked enough?
You get the feeling that it's gone down that fashion. I do wonder if they were somewhat to the aesthetic of Village, in the sense that they wanted to have this kind of gothic medieval type vibe with the vampires, and they thought, oh, this would be a good opportunity to tie in a bit with the origins of Umbrella. And I wonder if it's just been put in. You know what I mean? It's like, you know, they wanted that feeling of something quite old. But as you said, with retroactive storytelling, it can become quite problematic in how it's executed. I personally don't think it's done too bad. I agree with the comment about Ethan's death not being particularly helpful. I don't think it changes anything too much, other than it being a slightly pointless retcon, but then so was Sergei. I actually think the in-game storyline, this is, you know, from my original review, the in-game storyline of what Ethan goes through, what you play as, should I say, is still the best in-game storyline since 5. Whether all the surrounding lore matches it is a different question, and I think we've all been very, I'd say critical. I think we've cast a very critical eye, because obviously we are an in-depth lore podcast, so we want to examine that in minutiae detail. But you know, and I don't want to take away the impression that we didn't enjoy the game. I think all of us enjoyed it. We've all put it quite high in terms of our ratings. I just think we cast an eye because people want to know, you know, how it does tie in with everything else, not just at face value, but at an in-depth level.
I just want to quickly say I think the whole thing with the Umbrella logo and its origins was fine, but I just thought it was a bit cheeky by Capcom to build it up so much in the trailers.
I totally agree, yeah.
You know, it turned out to be nothing but a small footnote. And just to touch on what you said, Sean, I actually think all the connections to previous games outside of 7 don't come across as natural. They all feel tacked on and done as if they were done to appease older fans who would be looking for such things. You know, none of them feel particularly necessary, and they do cause plot issues when viewed from the perspective of the games they are referencing.
Yeah, what's interesting is I made this point, and I was quite rightly told, well, it's maybe piped down a little bit with the book that we found in in Dolby, that was written by the Abyss, the O'Brien book,
Clive O'Brien.
Yeah, the Clive O'Brien book. But then, like you said, John, it didn't actually have overreaching implications for the narrative. And it was even pointed out that he said that he was actually going to go off and write a book, I think, but it felt a little bit cheap. And even me with George Trevor now, I didn't quite like, the way that the George Trevor book suddenly was just it did feel shoehorned in. But they don't have overreaching effects on the narrative. But yeah, these ones do. Innate, they really do.
I mean, this was always something I felt about the Alyssa Ashcroft report. As excited as I was to have like an outbreak confirmation like that, what the fuck was she doing in Dolby? Of all the places in the world that she could end up where there's another bio attack or whatever, why of all the lovely landmarks of the entire world, why would the Bakers have an Arkley painting?
Yes.
In their hallway, and Village does this tenfold with its lore references, and all it exists to do is make the world feel really, really small.
I kind of have a double-edged sword to that, because obviously you have to have these connections and references, but narratively, most media does this. It becomes a universe that's infinitely much smaller than what it expects. Like it's the Star Wars effect, obviously everyone's connected to someone else no matter how big the galaxy actually is. It's just the way media works. So I just have to accept that, so I don't have too much of a problem, especially when it's just like Easter egg knots. All of a sudden here's George Trevor having a book about castles in Europe. Well, yeah, okay, thematically it fits to the style of Village, and it's a nice nod to a character related to the original game. Cool, I'm okay with that. They have a painting in the hallway of Arkley. Okay, that's weird, but all right, it's not groundbreakingly difficult to deal with.
Well, the Joe Kendo book was really good though, because I can imagine him being some sort of connection to the BSAA, and like Chris goes, "Oh, here's a book you might like." I did like that. I thought it was cool.
Yeah, I mean, homages are not too bad. And Easter eggs. It's just when we overthink them. It's like, I'm sure everyone chuckled when Heisenberg called Chris that boulder punching arsehole. That's just a funny little in-joke, but it's not. I've seen people like, oh, well, that must mean Heisenberg had spies in the West African branch of the BSAA and all this, and it's like, oh, God almighty.
That's the problem, isn't it? Absolutely, yeah.
This is the same stuff that created debates around what Claire says in Revelations 2 and the relevance to that in regards to situations in Code Veronica and how her mindset is now and blah, 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 blah. It's just like, it's just an Easter egg, people. Jeez.
Yeah.
They just thought it was.
How can Claire know about the Jill sandwich joke when she wasn't in the Spencer mansion?
It's the whole debacle with Claire and Steve Burnside, isn't it? She's referencing a line he said in Code Veronica. It doesn't mean her personality's changed and she suddenly thinks guns are more reliable than people. We just read into these things far too much.
Which is ironic, because I know we've been sitting here for the last few hours probably reading far too much into all this stuff. But, that's what we're here for this purpose, to be fair.
And I do want to point out, I know I've been very critical tonight, but I do want to point out that I think Village is an excellent Resident Evil game, and I really do like it a lot. I just have few too many problems with its story. But as a Resident Evil game, I think it's absolutely fantastic, and a lot of effort has clearly been put into it.
And I enjoyed the return to some of the puzzles. I'm not quite. I've seen people complain that they're not particularly difficult, but come on, put them up against the things, if you can even call them puzzles, in 4, 5, and 6. And it was a really welcome return. I love just the little reference in a painting to the bells, and you have to look around. And I thought they were great.
Even say the puzzles in 7 GT, to be honest, because the shadow puzzles aren't really much of anything, and you get an hilarious puzzle in Mia's section where you have to rotate some pictures, and it's just not even a puzzle really. It's just a color match more than anything.
There's still moments like that here with the Switch puzzle for the dam. It's not really a puzzle. It's
of the puzzle, isn't it?
It was a step in the right direction. I think we would.
I'm with you guys. I mean, I enjoyed the experience of the game, and I've played it. I've finished it 100% on the PlayStation 5, and I went back and tried it again, the PlayStation 4 version, and I really, really have enjoyed it as a gameplay experience. I think it's very well balanced on the gameplay front, with the one minor exception of me feeling like the factory dragged a bit, and the Heisenberg boss fight. I'm pretty much happy with the actual gameplay. It does come down to me really nitpicking at the lore, and I'm probably not even as bad as you guys, because I can forgo some of the stuff that you guys have been talking about on a personal basis, but I can definitely 100% understand where you're all coming from.
I know we obviously couldn't talk about it in the review podcast, but just before we move on, I do just want to say, as much as it is a one-trick pony, and it really doesn't have the same impact on any subsequent replay of the game, but that first time through Beneviento, I will never forget for the rest of my life, and I'm just on so many levels frustrated that it's not in VR, because that would have just been an absolutely mind-blowing experience given how good 7 was in VR, but at the same time it would have scarred me for fucking life, I can assure you of that.
Imagine being grabbed and eaten by that with the VR headset on.
Oh my God. Everything Stars just said about House Beneviento, I mean, the whole community's talking about it, aren't they? Just absolutely wonderful. Just wish it had been just lasted longer.
I do have a concern with it, which is that it was so, as we've all said, it's got a really good first time impression, but the second time around it doesn't have the same impact. But my problem is that Capcom will look at the response of that and go, oh, more of that, and kind of shuffle more towards that direction. And I want to implore the idea that it's fine if they can come up with an elegant way to make that sort of hallucination kind of thing work again, but don't just double down on the same trick, because it's not going to work again. Work because we weren't expecting it. If you just do more of that, it's not the same. It won't have the same impact.
My fucking heart was in my mouth through so much of that. It was, whoa.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if Rombie's alluding to this, but I felt that, like you say, it's absolutely terrifying. It was almost like, Resident Evil out Silent Hill, but it felt like so much of this game for me with the extended cutscenes and parts of the game that almost felt on rails. After a few playthroughs, it kind of felt very staged, and you kind of knew that no matter how far away you were from the baby at the end, when you got into the lift, it was always going to play out like it just got you. And so you're right, Rombie, there needs to be a bit more depth to the gameplay if that's to be an extended stage. Yeah,
we talked about this a bit, and I have still talked about it a bit more with other people since, but it's like the stuff with Lady D, for example, like she is definitely a more interesting foe than, say, the Nemesis was, as far as like creatively turning up, but she isn't quite that Mr. X level, because you can kind of trick her into getting stuck on things, or you just run into the save room and she just kind of gets bored and runs off. There's videos of people just doing circuits around the table and chairs in the main foyer bit of the castle. I think I mentioned this to you guys one other time as well, is that it's very interesting when it was more of a dynamic when one of the daughters would turn up and she was there, and I kind of wish that Capcom had realized that and doubled down on that a bit more. Perhaps maybe not scripted, but just had that element more often, because I found that much more challenging.
It's interesting, isn't it, with this? I hope people have listened and taken on board that, we are fans of the game. We love the game. In fact, most of us do. We're just looking very pedantically. Far too much for our own good, I would say.
We're the anti-fan brigade, apparently, is that what it was?
Anti-fan. Yeah, that was a comment. An anti-fan. We're not. We love it. We love it. It's just that it's just something to think about, isn't it? Because if you don't address these points, it's something to think about for the future, isn't it? For example, over-analysing Umbrella Corps, that's actually helped you helped us, if you like, in terms of the now rotten element of the BSAA, if that kind of thing. So that's the purpose of these podcasts, really, just to discuss the minutiae of the law.
Can I bring up one last topic for us to discuss then on that front? I mean, I have to look at this in the bigger picture of the whole thing. Do we ever feel like some of these things can never be reconciled? Like the fact that we can sit here and pull threads constantly because we are sitting here in the position as fans being able to analyze it, and we're not doing it from the purposes as Sean alluded to earlier in regards to the craft of getting out a really good game. Do you think these things will ever mash up? Do we think that Capcom can ever go down that narrative path where they will hit those notes perfectly, or do we think that that's just an unachievable goal and we're always going to have stuff to nitpick?
Oh, well, almost certainly. It's just the nature of fandom, isn't it? There's never anything perfect for everyone.
No. That goes back to your thing, Rob, about it being appealing to everyone and no one. I think no matter what game they make now, it will always have its critics and its fans. And I don't think they'll, the middle ground is always going to be a murky place to live in.
Which is why I think Village was so good, because I think
absolutely.
It hits a lot of lore point for us to discuss. As one of our concluding comments in the last podcast was, this game is going to be talked about for years And it will.
You know, I've said quite a few times on the Discord and on Twitter now that it's testament to how well the game is designed and the quality that Capcom have put into it, that it can still be this smorgasbord of ideas, and not all of them work, and there's some pretty, you know, hefty problems with the narrative, and still overall be a really good package and a game. And I see, you know, it's just broke today that it's, is it top of sales, I want to say?
Yes, yeah.
May?
It was sales for May and PlayStation, except for North America, where it was second. So
4 million copies
for
sold
PS4.
already.
Yeah, it sold very well. Obviously, yeah, we need to have a discussion about the Japanese sales at some point and the decline there. But PN US and other international sales have definitely been huge.
What was people's opinions on the ending, the epilogue with grown-up Rose?
I liked it for a sentiment. I'm on the fence with everything else about it. I thought it was a well done scene in terms of like the emotional beat it was going for, and the implication of the final moment, the figure approaching the car. I don't know what you're supposed to make of that, because if you weren't able to hack the camera, people would have no idea who the figure is.
You would take a wildly stab in the dark guess as to who it would be. I didn't even notice the figure the first time.
Right.
I thought the game had frozen.
Yeah.
I was like, why is the car stopped way off in the distance? And then it wasn't until the second time I was like, oh, there's somebody walking there.
Yeah.
It's so unobvious.
It's really deliberate, because the brake lights even come on the car.
That's what I noticed, but I was like, I thought the game had just frozen or something.
Rose's dialogue is very interesting, because there's a moment where the agent says to her, you know, you're a lot like your father, and there's a very deliberate pause, and I know. And I've seen some fan theory imply that she's able to sort of speak to Ethan through the mold hive mind or something.
The other part of the question is, when is this?
What do you think, John?
I'm just going to go with Occam's razor and just say, look, it's a nice bookend to Rose and Ethan's story, and it's her saying goodbye to her dad. It's Capcom showing us that, yeah, she's going to get a happy ending despite that her dad not doing so, and that's the end of their story, and we're not going to see them again. I don't think Rose is important. I don't think she's going to come back. I don't think we're going to hear from her. I think the figure in the distance is just a load of bollocks, and the whole scene, it's just the ending for the story of the Winters, and Resident Evil 9 is going to get back to concluded the mold story, the mold trilogy with Blue Umbrella. That's what I think.
Is it a time jump then or not?
Yeah, it's a time jump, because Rose won't have the same defect that Evelyn did that caused her to have rapid aging, or even if she did, because she was under the care of Chris and the government or whoever, they would make sure she got the medication she needed, because Evelyn went out of control because she'd gone rogue. There was no one looking after her, so, you know, she started to, her cells began to divide rapidly, and she aged to an 80-year-old woman in the space of a year, and that's clearly not happened to Rose, so it's just a time jump for me.
Nick, grab that piece of audio and save it, just in case. Sorry, John. I don't want you to eat your words, but if she does come back, I definitely want Nick to go. Previously.
If she does, fair enough. I just can't see it myself. I think it was just a simple scene just to show us that, yeah, Rose is going to get a happy ending. I think that's all it is.
But my question with that is, then why even show it? It was unnecessary if it's not going to lead to something else. Like,
I just
there's an implication of powers that Chris doesn't know about. Whole dynamic between her and the operative guard that's looking after her. To me, there's bigger. And then the whole bit at the end with the car stopping and someone walking towards it. Why put these in there?
Why didn't you name him? People on Twitter have put, side by side comparisons and shown he's Wesker.
Oh God!
Would people really be happy that then if Resident Evil 9 was set 20 years in the future and continued Rose's story and just left a 20-year gap in the timeline and completely ignored?
That's a different statement. See, this is the thing. I wouldn't be happy with that. I'd be absolutely furious.
I'd be very frustrated with it, because what they've done is effectively bring in a new super-powered young lady when they've already got a great one waiting in the wings.
Yeah.
With Sherry, and for all intents and purposes, like Rose and Sherry ultimately have ended up in the same place. They're both enhanced humans or implied to be enhanced humans. Why not just use the one you've got on reserve?
And Jake. I'm not meaning in a bad way. And Jake as well. Not in a bad way. Like he's just as powerful as well. Yeah. Totally.
I generally thought they'd set this up as a trilogy and that 9 was going to involve the Winters, but I think I'm with Batman, because if this was going to be an end of the Winters, then I think Capcom would have wanted to have bookended it in, with like a positive.
But then why put the figure in the distance? That's the thing.
Well, I think that's kind of a sentimentality bit for Rose, that that she's got to say goodbye to her father.
But isn't that the point of her going to the grave? Like, we need that little bit of extra out in case we need to do something with it.
So there we go. That does conclude and finish our in-depth lore analysis discussion of Village. We hope you enjoyed it. Let's look at the time. Have we got time for Neptune's Biohazard quiz? Yes, we do!
For the past 8 years and 5 seasons, we have brought you groundbreaking lore, in-depth analysis, game reviews, and high-quality content. We've also brought you untold controversies, and countless tales of underhand tactics, all in aid of the quiz.
I'd just like to announce, everybody, that this is 0 points for me this week. Thank you. Goodbye.
So my nomination person said 7, but I didn't agree with 7. I said it was 17, and then you said it was 17.
I didn't want people to think I'm cheating by just saying the same number that someone else has said, so I just the next number that sounds similar to 17. I swear I did not cheat, yo!
Jesus Christ. What kind of fucking question is that?
Quite frankly, if we only got 1 point and that's the winning score, then we're not doing our jobs right, and we're all going to have to hand in our Biohazard cards.
Welcome to Neptune's Biohazard Quiz. Batman. Star Tyrant. George Trevor. Rombie the Wrecker. Mr. Spencer. Neptune's Biohazard Quiz.
Hello and welcome to a special Resident Evil Village edition of Neptune's Biohazard Quiz. We have been sent 5 ludicrously difficult questions from JC Wesker, all to do with Village, so clear your
Thanks,
desktop.
JC.
Yeah, he's set a bar very high. Open up Notepad. Here we go. Question number 1. How do you tell the difference between the Dimitrescu daughters via hair colour and pendant colour?
Oh, so you want to know the 3 different colours?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
I don't even know which name goes to which, to be honest. Still.
I know there's a difference in colours, but I don't know which one's which, yeah.
No.
I'm 100% with you on that.
Yeah.
Question number 2 is a puzzle question. What is the correct order for the slideshow puzzle?
The slideshow? The film?
Yeah, the films, yeah.
The film reels, right.
Film reels, yeah. In-house Benevento, what Spanish word is written on the breaker box?
God, I didn't see that one.
Why would you see it, Rob? Why would you see it? That's what you should be asking yourself.
They like
Thanks,
to tease
JC.
you. This one's possible. Question number 4. What is written on the boat key tag? The little boat key you get?
Yeah, I'm getting a big fat 0 this week.
Yeah, I'm not going to get any of these.
They are ridiculous.
I've only played through the game once.
Question number 5 proves that JC Wesker has far too much time on his hands. How many pearls does Lady Dimitrescu wear?
I wonder what you were going with that question to begin with. Wow.
Has he actually counted them? Like,
I assume so.
I just got an image of like JC's paused his TV and he's like right up against the screen with a magnifying glass, looking at Lady D's like cleavage, and then Mrs. JC Wesker comes into the lounge and is like, "What are you doing?"
you need to moderate these questions, Nick. I mean, bloody hell.
To be fair, I think he did say they were going to be difficult.
There we go. They are the 5 questions. Join us after this and we'll run through those answers.
Tired of your shit! Where my lordy? That colder punching asshole! But you're first!
Question number 1 was, how do you tell the difference between the Dimitrescu daughters via hair colour and pendant colour? Rob?
Okay, so I just know there's 3 different colours. I couldn't tell you which one's which. There's one that's blonde, one that's like brunette, and one that's dark, almost black or something, I think. And the pendants are like 3 different colours. One's red, one's blah, blah, blah. Honestly, I'm getting a 0 for this question because I couldn't tell you which one's which. Yeah, exactly, because I can't remember which one's which. It doesn't really matter what I say because I can't associate with which daughter is which. So
okay,
I can't even tell the difference between the 3 of them anyway.
No, I honestly I don't know which one you fight first, second, third. The only clue.
JC, you're doing better than me.
Yeah, George.
Yeah, literally, like the night before I was interviewing Becca Pruitt, I suddenly was, oh my word, like I had to which is which. Like, so Baylor has blonde hair and has a red pendant, and then there's one of them has a green. I'm going to have to guess either Daniela or Cassandra. The other one has a green amulet. I'm going to say Daniela has red hair and a green amulet, and I don't know. That's all I can say.
Okay, Batman.
Yeah, all I know is one has blonde hair, one has brunette, and one has dark hair. They all have different colour pendants, but I don't know what those colours are, I'm afraid.
Stars?
Sandra, blonde hair, Bella, red hair, Daniela, black hair, and that's a total guess. I have no idea if it's right or not.
Okay, the answers is Bella has blonde hair and a red pendant. Cassandra has black hair and a yellow. Daniela has reddish dark hair with a green pendant. So a point to George Trevor. Well done. I'm giving you that. You got 2 out of 3. So very well done.
Thank you.
Question number 2. What is the correct order for the slideshow photograph puzzle? Start with Stars Tyrant.
I can't even remember all 5 of them. I've got Book, Rose, Teddy, and Wedding Ring, and I can't remember what the 5th one is. I think I've got a feeling it's potentially a picture of them on the beach, but I can't remember. No, 0.
Batman?
You want us to give you the correct order. Can you at least tell us what they are?
Would everyone like a clue on what they are?
I know this, so I don't have a clue.
You big...
Because I've done this puzzle so many times.
Consider yourself cock
because I've played, sorry.
No, the answer, Batman, because Rob does not need.
Oh, well, piss off, Rob.
No, you can give them a clue. I don't mind. It doesn't bother me. That's what I'm saying. I know the 5 pieces of film. I still might get this the wrong order around because I did stuff it up. I know what the 5 pieces of film are.
Right. Well, can I have a clue then, Nick? And I'll sacrifice half a point.
Okay, we'll go back to Stars and to give an answer as well then. Okay, so in no particular order, the answers are Sleeping Rose, wedding room, music box, monkey toy.
Yeah, it's the music box.
The Village of Shadows.
Then I will go. Teddy, Rose, Book, music box, wedding ring.
Okay, Batman, back to you.
I will go Village of Shadows, Book, teddy bear, wedding ring, Rose, and what was the last one? Oh, music box. That's my order.
George?
Seriously, I'm just going to be pleased to remember them, just to recount what you just said. I've got no idea now. I mean, I'm just going to, so we're not waiting for you, I'm just going to remember them in any order. Teddy, music box, walking on the beach. So it sounds like I'm recounting album covers. Can I just pass? Because we've been so
fine.
Because I'm not going to get this right.
The toy, stuffed toy, book, Rose, music box, wedding ring.
Correct answer. Sean, you're 1 out, my friend. Unlike point to Rombie. That is correct. Question number 3. What Spanish word is written on the breaker box? I mean, as if anyone would know this. I'll just put it out to anyone. Does anyone know it?
No idea.
San Miguel.
No.
That's why I'm so knackered now.
I'm assuming it has something to do with danger or electricity or something, probably.
No, Nick, I have no idea.
The answer is peligro.
Absolutely.
Of course. There we go.
What does it mean? Do we know?
The answer is peligro, not Italian, which could have been pericolo. If that would have helped in any way.
A well-known English word, yeah.
Yeah, there we go. Question number 4. What is written on the boat key tag? Batman. This is guessable if you don't know.
Boat.
George Trevor.
I've got no idea. You said it was guessable. I presume it's got something to do with Moreau. Moreau's boat.
Rombie.
It's a fish, and it says gone fishing.
Stars Tyrant.
Yeah, because I didn't know it, and it's just an opportunity to throw in Capcom's favourite ever word, I'm just going to say sluice.
If only. It's another point for Rombie. It is gone fishing. Well done. And finally, how many pearls does Lady D wear?
JC, seriously.
A lot.
Closest
been dethroned
answer.
with this one, hasn't he?
Closest answer will get the point. It's above 50. Stars.
64.
Rombie.
72.
George Trevor?
100.
Batman?
54.
One of you is one out.
Ooh.
The point goes to Stars Tyrant. It's 63. You were so close.
The belter.
And how do we know that's the correct answer? Can someone please officiate?
Yeah, can we have this
yeah.
verified, please?
JC's word for it.
Yes, we are. And all complaints could be directed to him. There we go. So let's have a look at the final scores. And what a rare sight this is, ladies and gentlemen. With 0 out of 5, it's Batman. Unbelievable. No points for Batman in the Resident Evil Village.
That's shocking.
Poor
It's not law-based. It was all...
He's had a very bad attitude towards this game from the start, hasn't he? I mean, that was a I mean, his intro was scathing. I came on this show thinking I was going to be the bad one of the podcast, but and to be fair, I actually only turned up because John said this was going to be a podcast about Mass Effect.
It's joint second place. It's Stars Tyrant and George Trevor with a point apiece, but this podcast winner with 2 out of 5, which, considering the questions, is highly respected, is Rombie. Congratulations.
Thanks, Rose Key.
There we go. That finishes this edition of Neptune's Biohazard Quiz. Join us next time when we'll have some more questions. There we go. So thanks JC for that. Yeah, thanks.
That second thanks just sounded like something one of us would say normally. Like, yeah, thanks for that challenge. That was good. I enjoyed it. I'm not just saying that because I got 2 points.
That does actually bring our extensive look at Resident Evil Village to a close. And the second of our trilogy of Village podcasts. Next up, we'll be bringing the podcast to you, where we'll be having our community call-in podcast, where we'll be opening the floor up to your comments and we'll listen to them. And usually what's great with these, they raise stuff we've completely forgotten. We'll be putting a call out on our usual channel for any MP3 call-ins if you want to get involved and have your say in the next podcast. So keep your eyes open for that. Once again, I would therefore like to thank everyone for listening. We hope you enjoyed it. We hopefully raised a few questions, keep us all guessing and talking for the next 2 or so years. On that note, it is goodbye from me, Neptune.
Bye from me, Batman.
Goodbye from me, Stars Tyrant.
Goodbye from me, George Trevor.
And goodbye from me, Rombie.